Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Imperial County Office of Education. I'm here through Project Muse. My name is Lupita Holguin Rubio. I'm a coordinator at Imperial County SELPA, and I'm also a coordinator of this Improving Outcomes for Multilingual Students with Exceptional Needs, also known as Project Muse. Today, my colleague and friend is joining me, Vanessa Lopez. We will be co-presenting today's session. This is day 2 of a series focusing on accessibility. So, on that note, we are going to get started because we're just a few tiny minutes behind schedule. So our focus today and our topic for this session is titled, Is Inclusion Accessibility, or Is Accessibility Inclusion? This is day 2 of a 4-part series, a tiered approach to accessibility. So if you are here, if this is your second day, welcome back. If this is your first day, welcome. Know that all of these sessions are recorded and will be uploaded onto our website, and we'll be dropping in our website intermittently throughout the day as well, so that you can access not only this professional development, but as well as other pre-recorded sessions and other resources that we have created through this project. Our resources today can be found on using this QR code or the bit.ly. I'll give you a few seconds to access it. All of the resources that we will be talking about and referring to can be accessed not only through the QR code and bit.ly, but are also embedded in the slide deck. So we will be making references to, click on the image, click on the title. All of the resources will be accessible through the slide deck so that you don't have to jump onto a different Padlet or any other type of platform to access all of our resources. Throughout this day, should you click on a link or a title or an image and the link is broken, please let us know right away, and we will make sure to address it immediately so that everything that we are referring to is accessible to you immediately. So just those of you that are present here, just give me a thumbs up if you've accessed the slide deck. And in the Zoom, all right, good to go. We invite you to follow us on our social media. Our Twitter account, or X account, that is at EL_SWD. And we've provided some hashtags to include. So if any time throughout today's presentation you see something that you like, you see something that resonates with you, we encourage you to absolutely get on social media. When will you hear that again, right? Go ahead and get on social media anytime during our presentation and just give us a shout out or share with those that are not joining us today some of your new learning and wonderings as well. Because this is a webinar, we want to be able to make sure that everybody is able to engage. And so there are a couple of features that we want to point out for those of you in the chat room, and as well for those of you that are here in person so that you know what's happening on the back end. So there is a chat box, so it's an opportunity for you to share your insights, things that resonate with you, maybe share some of the things that you're experiencing, etc., etc. However, we do ask that you reserve your questions by utilizing the Q&A icon on the Zoom platform. And that way we're able to address your questions in a more, in an easier way for us. Vanessa is right now sitting at the back of the room addressing those of you participating via Zoom. So again, it just facilitates us being able to address your questions if you utilize a Q&A icon as opposed to the chat. So reserve your questions for the Q&A icon. For those of you here in person, we encourage you, we invite you to engage in person with each other and with us. So just give us a sec to come to you with the mic so that our Zoom participants can also hear your questions and comments. We have planned our day in such a way to give everybody sufficient time to process and also what we call brain breaks, right? We need some time to just kind of process and take our bio breaks also to take care of ourselves, right? Our physical and mental needs. So we do have this schedule set out, but we also know that life happens and sometimes we're not going to take a formal break at a very specific time. Again, all of that to say that please take care of you. If you need to stand up and take a stretch, if you need to step out the door and take some fresh air, please take care of you. But just know that we are mindful of how important it is for us to stay engaged, and therefore it's important for us to take care of ourselves physically and mentally as well, to be able to engage more meaningfully. We are scheduled to finish up our day by 3 o'clock, but we do allow some time towards the end of the day to walk you through our website and some of the resources and newer resources that we've uploaded onto the website as well. So we might finish just a few minutes shy to allow some time for that. We want to introduce you to our team. Yours truly, Lupita Holguin Rubio. I am a coordinator here in Imperial County Office of Education. I'm joined here today with my colleague Vanessa Lopez. She will introduce herself shortly as well. Our senior director, Christina Zavala, is taking care of SELPA business because that is her day job. And hopefully she'll be able to pop in later on today and just say a quick hello. It's important for you to know the makeup of our team. So I will start off by saying that I am not a special educator. Please don't leave the room. Please don't log off. It's important for you to know this because the makeup of our team is very intentional. My background is English learners. So I've worked here at Imperial County Office of Education. This is my 23rd year. Wow, 23rd year at Imperial County Office of Education. The majority of that time I was working as a curriculum coordinator at our curriculum department, and I was charged with several projects, all of which focused on English learners, working with supporting teams, administrators, practitioners, enhancing their projects, and enhancing their instruction, enhancing their environments to address the needs of English learners. So that's my contribution. That's what I bring. As Vanessa would say, that's my superpower. That's what I bring to this team. My lens is language literacy in support of English learners. I've had the pleasure and the honor of working at the state level, at the regional level, and at the local level in support of English learners through several projects. The California Preschool Instructional Network, I was the EL lead for Region 9. The California Reading and Literature Project, I was the director for, like 13 years, supporting our Imperial County and collaboratively working at the state level with other CRLP directors, providing professional development in support of English learners. And now I'm bringing that background to this work, improving outcomes for multilingual students with exceptional needs. So although I am not formally trained as a special educator, I do believe that I have at least an associate's degree in special education, having worked for so many years with my partner and friend Vanessa, who is a wealth of knowledge of all things special education, as well as English learners. Having said that, I'm going to hand over the mic to her so that she can give us a little bit of background on herself. Vanessa?
Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. Super excited to be here with you today. And I think it's important for us to help set the context on the makeup of our team because it's very deliberate, very intentional, and we each have our own areas of expertise, our superpowers, if you will. My background is all things special education. I taught for 18 years at one of our local districts, and I worked in both the K-6 RSP setting and K-6 SDC setting. Some of my time at my local district was also spent as an English learner coach, a resource teacher, and an instructional technology coach as well. Here at the SELPA, I'm starting, I believe, my 5th year here at the SELPA, or my 6th year. It's a blur because it's been so much fun. And I wear many hats in addition to being a part of this grant work related to improving outcomes to multilingual students with exceptional needs. I'm also an AT assessor. I'm an APE specialist. I am currently also working on a variety of projects related to students with exceptional needs and those that are dually identified. But one of the superpowers that I'm most proud of, and it is a superpower, believe me, it takes strength every morning, is helping support my son, support him, and just help him be as much as he can be himself with his own superpowers, with his own diagnoses and his disability categories of autism and OHI for ADHD and generalized anxiety. So when I'm looking at the work that we do here today, I'm coming at it from multiple lenses, and I think that's very helpful because it really does help balance and uncover any blind spots that I might have. Lupita does that for me all the time, and also so that we don't live in this echo chamber where we are just continuously repeating things that we already believe, but really challenging each other on ideas, beliefs, practices, pedagogy, so that we can truly pull our expertise together and bring the team forward to develop resources, supports, and to really learn from all of you in the field, because you are those individuals that are doing the work, working with our students. So always, always, always a pleasure and an honor to connect with every single one of you so that we can build our own collective expertise in this dual capacity building framework that we call Project Muse.
Thank you, Vanessa. So again, we take the time to share with you the makeup of our team, our lenses, and that is the work that we invite you to do as well. So at this point, I would like to invite our Zoom participants to drop in the chat box who you are, what is your superpower, what role are you bringing to this day, to this work today, as well as our live participants. So those of us here live, just by a show of hands, if you are a general educator, please raise your hand. Nice, great, high five. And thank you for joining us. And do you teach? Are you an administrator? What grade do you teach? High school general education. Fantastic. Thank you for joining us. It's so important to make sure that we are inviting, and we always do invite our general education friends, our special education friends, our administrators. So thank you for being here today. Special education teachers. That's okay, good. How about administrators? Special education administrators, or a teacher on special assignment, like a coach or something like that, support staff. Okay, fantastic. And are you guys coaches? Instructional coaches, fantastic. Thank you for being here. So again, the makeup of our team is important and deliberate. We invite you to approach this work and your colleagues through that mindset as well. Think about who might also need to hear and know this information that you're learning today, and how might you begin to establish and nurture those working relationships so that we can address the needs of our dually identified students in a more effective, more productive, more meaningful way. So as we are introducing ourselves in the chat, again, it's important to know who is in the room so that we're able to navigate our conversations, our content, our topics with you in mind. So again, we are part of the statewide system of support. This is our second iteration of this grant work. If you are new friends, then you will know that we are the special education resource leads focusing on English learners. We're part of the statewide system of support, where there's multitude of agencies who are working together. We truly are working together, this iteration of this grant, to be able to, again, lean on each other, learn from each other, and put our projects together and create activities together to address the needs of all students statewide. Our lens, our focus for our project, Project Muse, is English learners with disabilities. But we are working very closely with the UDL agency, working very closely with Open Access, which will be joining us on day 3. And High Quality IEP as well. Thanks, Vanessa. Go ahead and chime in, girl. High Quality IEP, who, again, we're working very closely with them. So it's important for you to know that although we have this one focus of English learners with disabilities, we are working together and collectively with the other state agencies. And all of us are being supported and funded by the California Department of Education, as well as the California Collective for Educational Excellence. And so we want to thank them for their support and for sponsoring our grant and for allowing us another round of this very, very important work. So thank you to them. Again, this is a collective commitment. So at the state level, as the previous slide shared, we are working together. State agencies are working together. And here, more at the local level, Vanessa and I and Christina, our senior director, are working together, right, to provide these types of professional development and resources through these multiple lenses to help provide you with resources to enhance experiences for our English learners and English learners with disabilities. So it is a collective commitment. We like to say that it is a team lift, and in order for us to work more effectively, more proficiently, then it does require us to work collectively. So why is this work so important? Why focus on English learners? So this slide that we're sharing with you highlights the fact that our multilingual learners are present across multiple educational systems. So very quickly, 6 in 10 children are dual language learners. 6 in 10 children, 0 to 5, are dual language learners. So our littles, more than half of them coming into our educational system are bringing with them a language other than English. 1 in 4 English learners are also socioeconomically disadvantaged students. And so the extrinsic factors are impacting their progress in learning. 1 in 4 students are students with disabilities. 1 in 4 English learners are students with disabilities. So again, we want to be able to share with you today through this 4-part series considerations for English learners with disabilities, because the numbers indicate that we have a sense of urgency to do that. In the last 13 years, there has been an upward trajectory in the total number of students with disabilities, ages 0 to 22. And this is much higher than students that are general education enrollment. So again, these next few slides are going to just help us paint a picture of why it's so important to focus on this population of kiddos. Those of you joining us today, you understand that. But we share these slides with you so that you can then, again, share them out with those that may not be joining us here today. 25%, almost 25% of students who are English learners are students with disabilities. So 1/4 of the students with disabilities are English learners. That's a huge percentage. This may prompt you to think about, what does that percentage look like at my respective site? And how might I begin to address the needs of dually identified students? This slide shows the multitude of languages by percentage spoken in the state of California, home languages. And so we see here overwhelmingly that the Spanish is the language most spoken, other than English, at home by our students. So when we think about the needs of our English learners, we want to take this into consideration, but more importantly, we want to take into consideration what home languages are spoken from the students that you are working with directly. This is statewide data. Another very important data point is this slide right here, where we focus specifically on the language acquisition status of kiddos, of those who are English learners and those who are English learners with disabilities. One part of this slide, the pie that I want to highlight, are actually the reclassification percentage and the long-term English learner percentage. I'm going to give you a brief description of what a long-term English learner is. A long-term English learner is an English learner who has not made linguistic and academic progress of 2 consecutive years. Linguistic progress is determined by the LPAC. So if the student has not shown growth, from one language proficiency level to the other, and or regressed for 2 consecutive years, that student is now considered a long-term English learner. Usually, the long-term English learners are going to be between 6th grade and 12th grade. So we're talking about, upper elementary, middle schoolers, high schoolers. So a long-term English learner, the percentage of long-term English learners, I'm looking at the gray piece of the chart on my left, titled English learner. So we see that about 11% of English learners are long-term English learners. Now let's shift our eyes to the pie that's indicating English learners with disabilities. There's a huge discrepancy there, right? So from English learners who are long-term English learners, meaning students without English learners that do not have a disability, there's 11% of them. Whereas an English learner with a disability who are long-term English learners, 27%. So that's alarming when we think about why are our English learners with disabilities not progressing linguistically or academically. It makes me think about, what does the environment look like? What does the curriculum look like? Are these English learners with disabilities receiving comprehensive ELD? What does that look like? Are they offered linguistic supports? Is the content accessible? Are they able to engage in the content? Do they have opportunities to work with, alongside English-speaking peers where they have language models? So these are some questions that I ponder when I see this type of data back to back. Another piece of data that's really important for us to consider, as again setting the context for this work, is the top 3 qualifying categories for English learners for special education. So these are the top 3. There are 13, Vanessa? 13 qualifying categories. So these are the top 3 of which English learners are qualifying for special education. Most of you here in the room are special educators, and so perhaps you're not too surprised of the top 3 qualifying categories. However, what do you see as an underlying factor amongst these 3 qualifying categories? What do they have in common? You could just shout it out. Or if Zoom participants, type in the chat. What do you see that specific learning disability, speech and language impairment, and autism have in common? Say it again. Yeah, so these are English language learners, right? So 43% of English learners qualify for special education for SLD. So what does SLD, SLI, and autism have in common? Communication, processing, language processing, right? Language is an underlying factor, right, for these 3 qualifying categories. And we're talking about English learners. So if the top 3 qualifying categories for English learners for special education have an underlying factor of language, then that causes me pause. That causes me pause for different reasons. It causes me pause regarding how the students are assessed and how they qualify, knowing that these are language-based disabilities. The fact that these kiddos are learning English as a second language, it makes me wonder about the types of assessment that qualified them for special education. And if I go back a little further, it makes me wonder what and how English language development was taught and how that might have impacted the assessments that qualified them for special education. Now, moving forward, now that they have an IEP, I'm wondering what types of linguistic supports are being implemented and documented in their IEP so that they are able to achieve the goals that have been identified for them based on their qualifying disability. So lots of things that I'm wondering, not having a special education background. Those of you who do have a special education background, you may be wondering similar things or different things. At the end of the day, folks, we're talking about language acquisition, because we are referring to English learners, and academic language development, because we're talking about the language of school, right? Not social language, but the language of school. And that needs to be taught explicitly. It's not the language that kids learn in the playground or in the cafeteria or in social interactions. They're gonna pick up English in spite of what we teach explicitly. But in order for students to make academic progress and linguistic progress, they need to be taught academic English through the form of comprehensive ELD. And if we know that these percentages are true and accurate today, then we need to really think about, what does comprehensive ELD look like? What types of linguistic supports are my students, English learners with disabilities, being afforded so that they can have access to the content and have an equitable opportunity to achieve their goals. Okay, so again, setting the context with some data. This is current statewide data. Hopefully you'll have an opportunity, if you don't already know, what does that data look like at your respective site. We're gonna do a quick recap of last session for those of you who weren't here. It'll give you an idea of some of the kind of highlighted topics. And those of you who were here, it'll give you an opportunity to kind of circle back on some of the topics that we referred to so that we can make connections to what we're going to be reviewing today. So very quickly, the last time we were together, we were talking about, as English learners, our diverse group. So when we base our instruction, our educational programming on this kind of one-dimensional, they're an English learner and maybe they are an emerging English learner, and not take into consideration that perhaps a student is very proficient in their primary language and has had formal schooling, or maybe they didn't. So when we think about the different dimensions of an English learner and take that into consideration, we're able to craft instruction and educational programming to address their very specific needs. So again, similar to a student with a disability, I'm going to try and quote my friend Vanessa when she says, you know, when you know a kiddo with autism, you know one kiddo with autism. I would argue that the same is true with an English learner. Until we begin to learn a little bit more about their background, their experiences, their educational experiences, extrinsic factors that may impact their learning, such as low socioeconomics, such as mobility, such as health issue and emotional issues, trauma. All of those things are factors that impact all students. And when we're talking about English learners, we want to weave in the fact that they are also engaging in an environment, a school environment, in which their primary language may not be the resource that they're utilizing to learn. We also talked about and reintroduced the multi-tiered system of support. And we talked about how by design, this framework, the MTSS framework by design, is the most effective way to gauge progress and to provide the supports for kiddos. In essence, it is an effective pre-referral process because we've weaved out what students need, provided the supports that they need, engaged in some progress monitoring, and making appropriate tweaks and changes so that the student continues to progress. So the multi-tier system support by design is an effective pre-referral process because it allows us an opportunity to diagnose, address, implement, and revisit interventions based on student need. And finally, we spoke about universal design for learning as a framework for providing access and equity for all of our students. And today we're actually going to circle back a little bit more deeply into UDL, Universal Design for Learning, as we talk about accessibility, as we talk about accommodations, as we talk about making sure that we're providing access for all of our students, taking into consideration their multidimensional learning needs. And we shared one final resource with you, our pre-referral flowchart. Again, it can be accessed here through this slide. That gives us a tool to help us navigate through dialogue about what is the very best support that our students need when we see that they are struggling. So before we move directly into assessing for special educations, we want to make sure that we gather data and that gives us a full picture, a comprehensive picture of what the student is able to do. And then we're able to tease out the areas of need. And those areas of need may not always point to special education. They may need some intensive language interventions. They may need some additional resources. You know, maybe they are low SES, maybe they are trauma. And so we're able to identify what are the needs of the kiddo, why are they struggling, and direct them and provide the appropriate supports that they need. before we move on to special education assessment. So very quick recap of our last session together, setting the context and painting a picture of what English learners and English learners with disability looks like at the state level. Hopefully it's triggering some thoughts about what that data looks like for our own students back at our site. We're going to start diving into the topic and content for today's session, and for that I'm going to hand it over to Vanessa. All yours.
All right, Lupita, thank you so very much. I'll take the magic wand. Thank you. All right. Okay, everybody. So let's jump into it. Let's jump into the content that we've set up for you today based around is accessibility inclusion or is inclusion accessibility? And what are some of the caveats you must be looking out for? So let's get started with a history lesson. Most of us here are special education teachers, case managers, that's our background. But our friends in Zoom land, there's a vast array of practitioners joining in where perhaps special education is not part of the background, the experience, because we know that although we probably had amazing classes in our college years related to special education, if gen ed is our background, it always helps to be reminded of what some things stand for, what they mean, and what is consistent throughout. So here is a brief timeline of the Individuals with our Handicapped Act, which was back in 1979, Education for All Handicapped Children Act. That was 1975, which is not that long ago. And I say that with emphasis because I was born in 1975, so it was just like yesterday. So, and then in 1990, the EACHA was reauthorized as IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. In 2004, IDEA was reauthorized, and it added that additional I there, the IDEIA, the Improvement Act, Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act. We still call it IDEA because, like how do you say idea? So we just call it IDEA. So through this process from the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, IDEA of 1990, IDEIA of 2004, what has remained consistent is that all children have access to FAPE. We love our acronyms in education, but especially in special education. So access to FAPE, free and appropriate public education. Children with disabilities are eligible for special education, including APE and any other of those related services and direct services. And they must have a disability under one of the 14 categories named in IDEA. So we go from 13 categories to 14 categories because of the addition of established medical disability, but largely it's those 13. And that it is, if a child is determined that they have a unique educational need that has not been met without that service, must be provided. But in addition to that, we also have called out that education must happen in the least restrictive environment. That is including adapted physical education and all other services provided through special education under the disability categories, which as you see here are a service, not a placement. So let's spend some time sitting there in LRE world and looking at this next cartoon. So you might have seen this cartoon before, but I'm going to ask you to engage with it visually for a couple of seconds. And those of you joining us in Zoom, use the chat feature to share out what comes to mind as you're viewing this cartoon. And I want to remind you that we are in a brave space. This is a brave space where we can all share out, grow, lean on each other, and really share out our thoughts and processes with no fear of judgment, because what we want is growth. And growth comes from reflection and conversation, and we aim to provide that for you here today. So what comes to mind? And my live friends here with us, I have the mic. I will come to you. Don't be frightened. We won't film your face. Right, JC? Okay. So we just want to collect the audio so our friends in Zoom can hear out. All right, so I'll give you a second. What are you thinking? What comes to mind? Ooh, okay.
All this sits on the shoulders of the special education teachers.
And just because they're drawn like clouds doesn't mean they're light like clouds, right? What else? What comes to mind? Ooh, pressure, the other side of the room. What comes to mind? It can be anything. Why is that door crossed out? I'm running. I'm trying to run.
I think a lot of our job is to basically preach that special ed isn't a place and it's a service, no matter if it's SDC or RSP.
Perfect. Just as if I paid her. She'll take it. Probably to invest in your classroom, right? Okay, anything on Zoom, Lupita, that our Zoom participants may have shared about what they think about when they see this cartoon? And as you're checking the chat and continuing to use the chat to reflect, I really want to take a very superficial view and see that, okay, the door is crossed. That probably means that we're looking at special education as not a classroom, not a place. However, it's challenging sometimes because of the way our systems are structured. But really what special education could look like are what's in those clouds. Anything else to add from Zoom, Lupita?
Yes, there's a couple of actually, they're all really good, but I know we have time for just a few. All educators who work with the student with an IEP provide services, just like all teachers who interact with ELs should be using strategies to support them. Services and supports aren't only in special education classrooms. Special education is deeply fractured, but we try to be superheroes every day. And then it reminds me of my childhood and parents' experience, the stigma that parents imagine their kids being put in a separate room.
Wow.
And one more.
Yes, go ahead.
A lot of our job happens outside of the SDC, but in the mainstream environment, general education.
Absolutely. And if you notice, some of those little clouds there are blank because we know that in special education, a service can look in many, many ways. And in no way is this cartoon meant to be an exhaustive listing of what special education services and supports could look like. But the end result really is that we view special education not as the one place that our kids go to get everything, but rather as a layering of services, very much intentional to support the needs of the individual so that we can really start forming that context of accessibility, inclusion, and finally belonging. Lupita, something else?
Or I want to share. Collaboration between SPED and EL must be a part of daily life in the school. The door should remain open for this collaboration.
Yes. Ooh, I like that. So not only is it not a place, but doors should be open. I like that. I like that. So we're missing a couple of doors that are facing each other, right? So thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing. I really do believe that special education is a service, not a place. And I know that many of us do, and we constantly share that with our peers. But, you know, like it can be a challenge. It can be a challenge when we consider existing systems. However, as Lupita always likes to say, we are part of that system, and we should look at our own sphere of influence to see how it is that we can start advocating for some change to really lead towards that ideal pie in the sky collaboration, connection, communication to really be able to provide the necessary services and supports for our students that will eventually lead us to an inclusive setting. So as we go back to the LRE, the least restrictive environment, we know that it's mandated by law. We know that we consider a continuum of placements and services to establish the least restrictive environment. We know that what the LRE really is tied to is where can the child be successful, and it is dependent on the individual child. So I'm going to be peppering my section here with a couple of examples from my experience, and in no way is that meant to be the prototype of what it is like for everybody or what it should be, but more just sharing where it is that I come from and my own challenges that I experienced in trying to really approach the conundrum of trying to mitigate what exists and what we're trying to get to. And one of the more difficult ones is truly looking at the way our school days are structured, the systems in our school day, and a lot of times, unfortunately, we end up making decisions that are more about scheduling, time, resources, responsibilities that really act as barriers to truly develop a plan that is based on the individual child. So if we think of that historical perspective, right, of how we went from the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act to IDEA to the reauthorization in 2004, we know that the least restrictive environment was mandated by the 1970s. And that in response to that, we went to mainstreaming. And in my early years in my previous district, mainstreaming was, if I'm honest, just sending kids to a gen ed class. As I gained experience and connected with my students, I started making tweaks to that mainstreaming experience. But overall, the feeling is that mainstreaming really just became a way of sending student out without the necessary supports for a variety of reasons. So if you've been in education for a couple of years, you've seen how we've been little by little addressing these issues related to appropriate supports and accommodations that are taking us away from mainstreaming and more towards inclusion. I'm curious to know from you how you might characterize your personal experience as a teacher with mainstreaming, or attempts at mainstreaming, or attempts at inclusion. Take a minute to process that and share out. Zoom friends, Lupita will share out your questions, your reflections, and those of you joining us here, I will run over to you with the mic. All right, brave soul.
So in my time working at a few different school districts, I've had different experiences. I think a common experience we have with mainstreaming is it is kind of more of that dumping ground, and sometimes that's usually due to a reluctance from a lot of gen ed teachers, and that might be just because there might be lack of school resources and support, high caseloads, high student counts. There are many reasons. Some schools I've seen a lot of great mainstreaming support, and that usually comes from a different structuring of special ed, where they really do emphasize special ed as a service and not as a placement. So special ed students are not on a special ed teacher's roster. They go to the classroom at certain times, pretty much like a long form RSP, and that's usually worked out. I saw much more success in mainstreaming with that format.
Thank Thank you so much for sharing that. So let me, oh my God, I'm getting my steps in today.
Over there, I'm going to read something from the chat. I agree, it has been changing for better. Scheduling and support has been challenging. Definitely plenty of hesitation, reluctance, and anxiety from general education teachers. And I want to add to that comment as a general education teacher who did have special education students in my classroom once upon a time. There is a sense of, what do I do? How do I do it? Am I going to make a mistake? Am I going to hurt them? So it's important, again, for all of us here who are not general education teachers, as well as those of us who are general education teachers, to know that, again, back to the team lift, right, Vanessa? To lean on each other. You know, so if I'm honest with myself, I have to ask myself, what did I do to reach out to the special education teacher to say, hey, can you give me some pointers? Can you show me? What do I need to know? Or if I had a question, you know, connecting with her directly. So those are the things that can be done easily. That because, you know, me and my mindset, I want to stay in my lane. I was a barrier. You know, I was a barrier in making my content perhaps more accessible, my environment perhaps more inviting, right, more inclusive. Not because, you know, I didn't want to do it, but just the unknown and not feeling equipped to be able to address the needs of my students at the time.
Thank you. All right, let's see.
So I've also worked in a variety of different school districts and settings, and one component in terms of streaming that I've seen that lacks for sure is the collaboration component. A lot of times we don't really evaluate if these kids are ready to be put in that environment. Can we test it out for a week or two, see how it's fitting to them, see if they can actually, you know, do things, or it's going to be a conducive environment for growth for them. Instead, we just throw them in based on, sometimes it's like, where is this coming from? And then sometimes it's hard because the gen ed teachers don't even get that heads up until the day of the meeting. Or even the case manager as well. It's like, this is where we're going, this is where parent wants to go, but there's not really, you know, like a really in-depth search if this is the right environment. Can we test it out? Can we see? And then the collaboration time that needs to take place between the case manager, sped teacher, and the general education teacher to make sure that that teacher receiving that child knows, you know, their disability, knows their accommodations, their modifications, knows how to work with them, and maybe there's some shadowing back and forth between the two. But I think that that's a big piece that I've seen that's missing, and I know like we're going towards this inclusion model as well, but I believe that the collaborative portion is also a component that is lacking and that we're still trying to figure out, I should say. But I believe that that's a key component because we need to make sure that on both sides, for the gen ed and the sped or case manager, whatever it is, that we are connecting, collaborating, and making sure that we're creating that environment for the student to be received properly in, and so that they can be successful to the maximum extent possible.
Right. So not doing inclusion just for the sake of doing inclusion, but doing it well, considering the child as a whole and the system. So Lupita, thank you so much for sharing.
From the chat. I reached out for support but didn't get many answers at my school because I have gen ed classes that are 60 to 70% students with IEPs, and the remaining students are ELD or recently RFEP'd. After months of being a squeaky wheel, we are looking at changing our scheduling practices for ELA 9 next year. It was my understanding that we were not offering LRE. So again, being the squeaky wheel, reaching out, it speaks to me from when I was in the classroom many moons ago and having all these questions going through my head that would keep me from making my classroom more inclusive, from reaching out and offering myself an opportunity to learn because I was afraid. I was afraid, like, do I know this? Do I not know this? Should I know this? So again, it's just removing myself as the barrier and reaching out and asking for support and help. Because then, in essence, that's where change begins, right?
Yeah.
Me first.
Absolutely. Fantastic reflections and sharing out. Because really, again, thinking back to my experience and considering what everybody else here shared, where did I mainstream? PE, right? Because it's the easiest. But might that have been appropriate for all? Right? Are we considering how it is that we're even transitioning our students into that mainstreaming? How are we transitioning our peers? And as I'm hearing all of the reflection around collaboration to truly be prepared to move from mainstreaming to inclusion, I hear collaboration between gen ed and SPED, but when we're talking about dually identified students, our ELD friends, right? Our ELD friends are critical in this equation because we know that, as Lupita shared earlier, we have English learner typologies. It's not a monolithic group. So we want to consider who it is that we're bringing in to help us incorporate some linguistically based supports for our students depending on where it is that they're at, because that is going to be important also. So moving across the spectrum from LRE to mainstreaming to inclusion as reflection points, we land finally on inclusion. And inclusion can be seen as a movement or a philosophy. Many people say that this inclusion thing is new, but I think many of us in special education have been striving towards inclusion and belonging from the very beginning. However, it's getting a lot of traction lately, right? A lot of lip service. And it's important for us to leave it not at lip service, right? So what we say when what we mean when we say inclusion is that we're asserting that most children can be included in general education if the conditions and the supports are provided. And we want to consider the following: natural proportions, UDL, aids, supports, paraprofessionals, additional personnel, adaptations, which can be accommodations and or modifications, co-teaching, consultation, specialized equipment, etc. Again, not an exhaustive list, but something to consider when we're looking at individual students and their needs, especially if we're seeking to go from mainstreaming to inclusion. Providing the least restrictive environment has many, many facets for us to consider, because we know that sometimes for some students, the least restrictive environment might seem more restrictive on the surface, but it's what's appropriate for them in the moment. So very quickly before we take our first scheduled break, I wanted to connect a little bit to ELD and the least restrictive environment as well. In day one, we talked about, and I'm going to keep referencing day one because I really want to connect the dots to how everything is connected and linked, and it's not necessarily something that exists separate from the other. So when we're considering the least restrictive environment, that also applies to comprehensive ELD. In day one, we touched on the fact that ELD for English learners, including those with disabilities, is part of core instruction, a function of general education. So when we are thinking of providing the least restrictive environment for students with disabilities, it may be, in fact, that the most appropriate environment for them will be in the general education classroom. However, with students that have more extensive support needs or have very specific, perhaps medically based needs, who have multiple disabilities, who have just that level of additional support where ELD might be best provided in a special education classroom, knowing that we can have a continuum of what those supports look like to provide the least restrictive environment is critical. And I bring this up because it also applies for other areas. We talk about English learners with disabilities and the top 3 disability categories, but we also know that we have students who might have APE as perhaps their only direct service, special education service. And even there, the concept of the LRE applies. We're looking at a continuum of services there because really, as we're striving towards inclusion and inclusive settings, the question is, what would be better? What would be better to serve our students? Lupita? Okay. All right. So Lupita's giving me the wrap it up signal. It is 9:31. We will reconnect in 5 minutes. So 9:36, see you back. Zoom friends, take your break. We'll start at 9:36. Hopefully you got the break you needed. Had some time to process some of the information and some of the resources. And I really want to spend some time addressing a question that popped up in the Q&A for our Zoom participants because I think it's excellent. So the question is, what might natural proportions look like in a special education classroom where 40% of the students are students with an IEP? So if we think of a traditional self-contained SDC classroom, then we know natural proportions aren't going to necessarily work there because already the makeup of the class is mostly students who have an active IEP, so it wouldn't necessarily work there. So when we're talking about natural proportions, that's more applicable to a general education setting. So as we are supporting our students to be included in a general education classroom settings, one of the points of consideration, again, not the sole determinant factor, but a point of consideration was to try to be as aligned as possible to these natural proportions, which range from 10%, some people say 13%, 15%, but roughly 10%, meaning that if you have 30 students, 3 students would have an active IEP. So as a point of consideration, not necessarily mandate, as it is not mandated in any way, shape, or form, just one of the many considerations as we look at moving towards inclusion. All right. Again, I also want to remind you that we truly do welcome your questions, and if you're joining us on Zoom, use the Q&A feature. We'll address them, whether it be live or type a response to you as soon as we get to them. And if you have any questions that arise after our time together today, feel free to email those questions to us as well. Friends who are joining us here live, you can drop us a little post-it or ask us directly when we have breaks as questions arise. All right. So let's continue setting the context for this conversation on is accessibility inclusion or is inclusion accessibility? But before we do that, it's important for us to have some working definitions, right? So, accessibility. Last time we talked about accessibility resources, and we hear this often, accessibility, accessibility, accessibility. In a nutshell, accessibility is about ensuring systems are designed so everyone can fully participate in public or professional life. And in the case of our students, in their academic life. Inclusion means that everyone has the resources and opportunities they need to fully participate in public and or personal life. For our students, this also includes their academic life. Belonging, however, which is our end goal, goes one step further. It's about fostering a culture where everyone feels accepted and supported. So up until this point, we've been talking about students who are dually identified. However, before they had any of those labels or those services or whatever you want to call it attached to them in our educational system, we are looking at individuals. Individuals with a jagged learning profile, with the relative strengths and relative weaknesses. Nobody is up and down average. We have a jagged learner profile. On top of that, we have multiple dimensions of identity. Culture, ethnicity, disability, race, sexuality, gender, And in our role as practitioners in supporting the whole child and serving the whole child, we seek to validate, affirm, build, and bridge, the famous VAB framework. So again, it is not just about the disability. It's not about whether the child is SLD and an English learner at the bridging level, but we're also considering the entire child and dimensions of identity. Lupita, is there a question? Okay, perfect. So when we're considering the whole child, that also plays a very important role in accessibility. In education, accessibility is shaped by what we need to do, our interactions with the environment, and our personal preferences. A person with a disability can acquire the same information, engage in some interactions, and enjoy the same service in an equally effective, equally integrated manner with substantially equivalent ease of use as a person without a disability. So that is the basic framework of how accessibility is shaped. What we need to fully be able to integrate and participate with our environment and in our personal preferences. So to set this in a context, I truly believe in using media to help tell the story better and to experience another person's journey. And what we're going to do now is spend a couple of minutes listening to Dan Habib give a TED Talk on disabling segregation. Fingers crossed this works.
Picture yourself back in your grade school classroom. I don't care if it's elementary school, middle school, high school. Just put yourself back there for a second. Look around the classroom. Do you see any kids with and without disabilities studying together and learning together? Raise your hand if you do see that. One or two. A couple of people in a room of about 100. Okay. Did you have a best friend who had a disability? A significant disability. A few people. Okay. Did you have a boyfriend or a girlfriend that had a significant disability? One person, two people. Okay, in a room of 100. All right, let's be honest for a second. Did you feel some fear or nervousness when you were a kid about talking to a kid with a disability? Raise your hand if you felt some fear or nervousness. Okay, probably a majority of the room. We have something in common. I felt exactly the same way. That's me at 4. I was in preschool, and I became friends with a boy named Richard. And there was something different about Richard. Richard had a headband on all the time. And it was a little strange to me that this kid always wore this headband, and I started wondering, what's under the headband? Because Richard was different because he had this headband. And I learned that Richard had a lot of surgeries, and I always wondered, what did those ears look like under that headband? And it was kind of scary to me to think about how different Richard was. As I got older, went to college, disability honestly was just a blip on the radar screen for me. It was not a big part of my life. Met my wife, we had our first son, Isaiah. Isaiah is one of these kids that at 10 months, he was walking, he was talking, he was always ahead of the curve. And then Samuel came along. He's cute, isn't he? I'm biased. I think he's very cute. I was thrilled. We had another boy. My wife, Betsy, and I were like, we know how to do boys. This is great. We could do boys. And I started envisioning all the things that they would do together like I did with my brother. Playing baseball, wrestling, going hiking as a family with my sister and my parents. And I just started, it was wonderful to kind of envision this in my mind until we noticed a few things. One of the first things we noticed were his hands. And if you look closely at the picture, you see his hands are balled up in a fist. That's not really typical. So we went to Samuel's pediatrician and we said, listen, we're seeing some things that are different with Samuel. What should we do? And he said, listen, kids develop in different ways. Don't worry about it. Let's just play it by ear. But just to be sure, let's go see a neurologist to make sure there's nothing wrong. Okay, we get a little nervous about that step. We see the neurologist. He does lots of blood samples, skin samples. And a few weeks later, I get a phone call, and the neurologist says, Mr. Habib, I think your son has a mitochondrial disorder. Let's get together in a few weeks and talk about it. So I did what no parent should do, but every parent would do. Want to guess? Google mitochondrial disorder, of course. And the first thing that came up was usually fatal. And I felt like I was kicked in the stomach. And I remember thinking, what does this mean? What is this going to mean for our life? Now, thankfully, I now know there are thousands of mitochondrial disorders that have lots of different ramifications. But in Samuel's case, it did cause cerebral palsy. So suddenly we were on this journey that we never, ever expected to be on. So every night, my wife and I would be together at the dinner table, and we would be talking to each other. What did Samuel do today? Did he roll over at all? Was he sitting up? Was he talking at all? Just trying to see, is there some sign that he's getting better? I remember a physical therapist telling me, if you massage him each night, it might loosen up his muscles. So I would do those massages. And on the nights when I forgot to do that massage, I would beat myself up. I'd feel so guilty that I wasn't doing what I needed to do to fix him. We started wondering, what's his life going to be like in school, in the community, relationships, work, college? How can he go to college when he can't even hold a pencil? How can he play with his friends when he can't just run outside? It was completely overwhelming. Over time, we finally came to terms with the fact that Samuel had a disability, and he would have a disability, a lifelong disability. So what do we do now? And what we realized we had to do was create a vision for Samuel and let him create a vision for himself. So what would that vision be? The vision that became obvious to us was that we needed to make sure that he felt like he belonged. That he belonged in our neighborhood, that he belonged in our community, and perhaps more than anything, that he belonged in his local school. Because how can you feel like you belong in your community if you don't feel like you belong in your own neighborhood school, which is the hub of the community? So that got us thinking about inclusion, because for him to go to his local school would mean they would have to work to include him.
All right. Thoughts? And by the way, this video is an amazing one, and you can find it along with others in one of our partners in the California Statewide System of Support websites, Supporting Inclusive Practices, SIP. So let's think about our conversation so far towards inclusion and what Dan Habib shared with us. Reflections, thoughts? Do we have anything in Zoom, Lupita?
I think this is something that I try to keep in mind with all my students when I go into like IEPs. It's something that I know their parents have gone through. I personally didn't experience it with my kids, but I know that it had to be devastating, and they do need a place, and we are like their advocates. So just a thought.
Thank you for sharing. That's such an important point, because as I stated at the beginning of our time together today, I have a son who's autistic, and he says that himself. So he says, Mom, I'm autistic. I'm not a student with autism. And I respect that because he's advocating for who he is. But going back to your point, I think it's really important to remember that, because prior to me having the honor of being Bobo's mom, that's what we call him, Bobo, I was a teacher, special education teacher. I was a case manager, and my IEP meetings were always, of course, about students with disabilities. And I had a role as the case manager, as a SPED teacher, to ensure that we developed the IEP and that it fit within my schedule. And then I provided the services that we had available, blah, 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 because these were students on my caseload. One of 28 when I was in the RSP setting. One of 16 when I was in the SDC setting. But to that parent, it's their one. It's their one child. So listening to Dan Habib talk about Samuel really brought me back to my experience as teacher, as a case manager, and also to my own process in accepting that my son had multiple disabilities. So important for us to keep that in mind. I'm sure we already do. But it's going to be critical as we continue our time together today, because we're going to keep revisiting Dan's journey, Samuel's journey with inclusion. Inclusion, inclusion, inclusion. But what is it? So me, I'm a visual learner. And I know it's hard to tell because I've been talking and talking and talking. But I learn best when I see something accompanied with a visual representation. So if we think back to our earlier slide where we talked about the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act, IDEA, and the reauthorization in 2004, it's really illustrated here by exclusion, separation, integration, and inclusion. These visual models are a diagram that's adapted from Think Inclusive, and I've linked it there in case you want to learn more. And I'm going to walk you through how I see it through my eyes. So as I mentioned earlier, born in 1975, that means that I completed most of my schooling in the 80s. I remember that there was a trailer in my elementary school that was way at the back of the field. Students went through a back gate to access that trailer. They did not have access to the main entrance that the rest of us walked to school into. Which one do you think that is? What was I experiencing? Was it exclusion, separation, integration, or inclusion? What do we think? Separation, right? Because I mean, we had already moved away from not educating children with disabilities, which was this exclusion. It was 1980, 1981. We were seeing separation. Yes, in the campus, but separate out there. Those students who were my peers had their own recess, didn't come out and play when we did, had their own lunch, and were not involved in our programs. Christmas program, spring program, dances, so separation. By the time I was in the classroom, the push was clearly integration. It had been well established already, but it looked very much like that. Yes, in the gen ed environment, but in the kidney table at the back. Yes, in a gen ed environment, but with their aid. Were they in the classroom? Yes. Is that better than separation? Absolutely. Did it take generational strides to get there? Absolutely as well. But that is not inclusion. Inclusive education is when all students, regardless of any challenges that they may experience, are placed in age-appropriate general education classes that are in their own neighborhood schools to receive high-quality instruction, intervention, and supports. Going back to Dan talking about SAM. Neighborhood school, fully included. That enable them to meet success in the core curriculum. So I want us to stop and read what's there, but also what's not there. What is there that resonates with me is one of the practices, again, confessional here, that I engaged in, which was when I was in the 4-6 SDC setting, some of my students went to a second grade classroom for mainstreaming, went to a third grade classroom for mainstreaming. Again, brave space. It was practice, right? And I wish I could say that we were at the only site where that was happening. What might that do to a student? Behaviors, humiliation, shut down. And we wonder why they wouldn't want to go to their mainstreaming time, right? So again, this is not a judgy McJudgy pants moment, but it's about stopping and reflecting and thinking of past practice in the path towards inclusion. Once you know better, you do better, right? Now, what's not there is the time and age-appropriate general education classes. Because I think that's also a misconception, right? That when we talk about inclusion, it's all or nothing, and it has to happen from one moment to the next. Starting tomorrow, all kids 100% of the time in a gen ed environment. That is not what inclusion is, because that might not be appropriate for all students, right? It's the end goal, a philosophy, an approach accompanied with a set of inclusive practices. So as we continue to explore the notion of inclusion and how it relates to accessibility and then finally to belonging, we're going to keep revisiting some of our previous points from day one. Day one, we talked about the curb cut effect, meaning that the sidewalk curb cuts, right, were initially made available for individuals with disabilities who utilized a wheelchair for mobility to have access to sidewalks, to be able to cross streets safely, effectively. But in the end, many segments of the population ended up benefiting from those curb cuts, myself included. I talked about pushing my monstrous 2-baby stroller everywhere up a ramp, and these were not designed specifically for me. However, they made buildings accessible to me. They made sidewalks accessible to me as my kids were riding their scooters, riding their trikes. It allowed them to be able to get on and off streets, driveways, etc. And most importantly, it allows our FedEx and UPS drivers to deliver our Amazon packages, right? Like easier. So everybody benefits when we start thinking about the most vulnerable in our communities and making resources, environments, books, materials, media accessible for all. Cartoon time. So earlier I showed you the cartoon about special education as a service, not a placement. Now that we've talked a little bit about inclusion, I want you to take a look at this cartoon. Read it, look at the prompt, and use the chat feature to communicate your musings, your reflections, your comments as to how might this cartoon be interpreted. Are there any implications related to accessibility, related to inclusion, related to belonging? I'll give us a minute to read, process, and respond. Okay. All right. Right off the bat, yes.
And this is kind of like a comment. I mean, it does address the questions too, but the accessibility of the ramp would obviously give everybody access to the space. But in an IEP, over the last 3 years, I had a student who I had the suspicion of having some dyslexia issues. Mom was receptive to the ideas, psych was all over it, and dad was like, wait a minute, no, that can't be, and was resistant to it. Sitting in the IEP, we were talking about accessibility tools and things like that, and the dad was concerned about him being able to go to his tournaments and things like that, and in places where he would be on his own having to read and things like that. So we talked about simple things that he could use. And I mentioned cell phones and text-to-speech and all of those type of things, and he was kind of like, well, that's cheating. And I said, no, those are accessibility tools. They've been around. They were made for students or people like your son, not for us. They were made for people like them. We just take advantage of it. So I see that mimicking a situation like this. And I think technology is going to take us in that direction and support people with those types of needs, but it's not going to be viewed that way as much. But we do need to just make sure everybody sees it as that's the use that it's here for. And it's not a cheating tool, it's an accessibility tool. So just
Absolutely.
my comment, observation.
That's fantastic. Thank you for sharing that, because isn't that one of the big struggles that as SPED practitioners we come across? No, well, I don't want to do the accommodations because that's cheating. But that's not fair because the other kids don't use that. Which my retort is always, well, because they don't need it, right? It's a simplistic example, but I always think of glasses, right? So I wear glasses. I'm not wearing them today because I'm vain. But what if I made the call of like, okay, well, guess what, students with glasses, because everybody else doesn't wear them, you can't use them. Or guess what, guys, to make things equitable, everyone wears glasses. Same graduation. It's the same impact when we say that we're not going to provide X, Y, or Z for a student who needs it. So, so thank you for bringing that up, because that is yet another myth-busting charge that we engage in as special education teachers all the time, myth-busting the cheating stigma on providing necessary accommodations. Anything in the chat, Lupita, related to the cartoon?
There's a couple of comments that I would like to share with the group. The practice that educators use to create an inclusive, accessible environment can support all students. It can create a sense of belonging for all students and help students with disabilities not be labeled, since all students can benefit from inclusive practices.
Fantastic. Is there anything else?
Another one I think is share-worthy. They all are, by the way. Sometimes tackling the needs for our SPED students can create avenues of success for many students who may benefit from these approaches. And there was another comment giving an example, such as integrated ELD, because it happens across and throughout the curriculum, the content, that focusing on academic English although it's specifically designed for English learners, a requirement EL service for English learners, integrated ELD can be beneficial for all students simply because we are scaffolding content with language levels in mind, therefore making the content more comprehensible for those students who absolutely need it, and perhaps for students who are still not fully fluent in academic English. So I want to just share those two comments because it's very true, very true.
Fantastic. So yesterday, Lupita and I were waxing philosophic on this image and thinking of the many ways that it could be interpreted. And you know, if you read the cartoon bubbles, the gentleman is shoveling, and the young man comes by and says, "Could you please shovel the ramp?" Because clearly that's the way he's going to access the schoolhouse. And the gentleman who is shoveling the snow says, "You know what, like there are all these other kids waiting to use the stairs as well. When I get through shoveling them off, I will absolutely clear the ramp for you." Didn't say no. Didn't say no. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 kids, 7 kids waiting for the stairs. So this gentleman is doing his job, right? But what's missing? What's missing? The young man who uses the wheelchair for mobility says, "If you shovel the ramp, we can all get in." So it can be seen different ways. One of the ways that I look at it is that a lot of times we have tons of accessibility tools. Many of them. If we would do a classroom inventory, if we would do a school-based inventory, we could rattle off lists for days as to what is there that's accessible. What's missing is the fluency with the practice of accessing and making it part of how we do things. So clearly, this ramp is there because we value all students and we want them to access the school environment. However, some of the practices might need recalibration. Where maybe it's like, yes, we start with the ramp because now it's accessible for everyone. But that takes practice. That takes time to make those practices innate and where we don't think about it as a separate thing to do. Like, how do I provide access to all? The ramp. Once I'm done with the ramp, I can move to the stairs. And going back to the reflection about cell phones and using the tools that are included in the cell phone for somebody who might be struggling with reading due to dyslexia, a lot of those tools are readily available in our pockets, in our school settings. All of these tools sometimes are limited because of the way our systems are set up. My husband's a high school teacher, and he and I always talk about all these issues related to education, which, yes, makes us a very boring couple. But we always get into these spirited discussions, and we're parents to a 15-year-old girl, so you know she lives for her cell phone. And one of the discussions we have is about cell phone usage in the classroom and how some classrooms have very strict check in your phone, check out your phone at the beginning and at the end of class. Whereas other classrooms, there is a more lax cell phone policy where you don't need to check it in, you just keep it in your backpack or your pocket, just I don't want to see it out. And then there's other classes where the cell phones are part of the instruction, part of the teaching. And they're allowed to be put out on the desk and they can have it out there to take screenshots for their notes, to submit electronic notebooks instead of the written notebooks. So taking a look at how it is that we manage what is already there in our classrooms is also part of the equation, but it's also part of how the system is set up. I understand the fear around having cell phones so readily available because of social media, because of potential photographs, videos of situations that perhaps shouldn't be photographed or videoed and then shared widely. But also exploring avenues to mitigate some of that, like geofencing, right? Where certain apps aren't available in a certain geographic location, and you use those resources to geofence and not allow access of some apps. Expensive? Yes, but considering removal of barriers is more important, because imagine how much more useful it would be for our students to know that they can start using their phone as a academic support, as an executive functioning support. I know I couldn't survive with some of the tools that are in my phone. I don't even know any phone numbers by memory. Well, maybe one or two. But I would be lost without it. Where am I supposed to be this morning, right? Oh my goodness, I had a doctor's appointment. I forgot. Thank you for that text reminder. So all of these tools that we utilize in our daily life are ripe for exploring in classroom settings so that we can start making those connections and really move towards a more inclusive setting. And here's another analogy differentiating between accessibility, accommodations, and inclusion. So I have a picture here of a cafeteria, and using the previous cartoon as a context builder, let's pretend that this cafeteria is on a little platform. In order for students to access, they need a ramp. The ramp is there. Student uses their wheelchair, their walker, to get in. Where will they sit? Oh, you can't see it there, but there's a table at the back. They can use that table. Is it a cafeteria table? No, it's a table, but they're in the cafeteria. They use the ramp. They can put their tray on there. They can eat. We're not saying they can't eat. They're in the cafeteria. Like, how is that not inclusive? We are inclusive. Are we? If we think back to the marbles, are they truly mixed in? Or are they still just have a table? Yes. But are they truly included fully? So accessibility would be the ramp, right? It's accessible. It would be the table, right? There is a strict rule that students must go individually, one by one, up by the cafeteria so they can scan their card and get their own tray. Okay, we're going to accommodate by having somebody move the tray onto that student's lap tray to be able to go to the table. Okay, that's an accommodation we're doing for them. Might there be like a least restrictive one than having a person put the tray on him and have him be less dependent on another individual so that he can build his own independence? The other might, but that's a starting point. But how do we get to inclusion? And really that's the premise for our conversation today, right? Is accessibility inclusion? And is inclusion accessibility? And it's important for us to keep that in mind, because when we're understanding accommodations, it's really about addressing, mitigating the challenges or barriers that our students are experiencing in their day-to-day life. As educators, we provide the accommodations to ensure access, whether they be environmental, physical, academic, organizational, linguistically supported, minded, etc., right? So for the student to have that accommodation written into their IEP, it's part of the IEP process as we're considering the individual needs. Here's a student who has some mobility issues, who utilizes a wheelchair for movement around campus. So an accommodation that we're going to have for them is to have an individual support them in the cafeteria with handling their tray and scanning their card. That wouldn't happen if we wouldn't have an individual advocating for that accommodation to support that particular student. The accessibility is already there in the table. The accessibility is already there in the ramp. But we also need accommodations to ensure that the combination of those accessible resources and those accommodations progress towards a more inclusive experience for our students. So that takes us to, again, this versus that. So accommodations versus accessibility, accessibility versus accommodations. So I really appreciate the University of Wisconsin for just being so succinct in their differentiation between the two. So accessibility is about planning to create an inclusive environment for all. So from the very beginning, you start planning for everyone. Whereas an accommodation is eliminating barriers for an individual upon request. And that's important in our world as special educators, right? In that this is very much part and parcel of the IEP process. We support a student by eliminating barriers for the individual, because that's what the I in IEP stands for, but usually it's upon request, but as special educators, we're trained to identify need. So right away, we will know, right? A student won't necessarily have to tell us like, hey teacher, I need somebody to help me carry the tray. We're going to already have enough experience and preparedness and awareness, and many times special educators, teachers in general, are so intuitive in our student needs that you'll already know exactly what that student might need. So accessibility is more of a proactive approach, whereas accommodation is more reactive. And yeah, that sounds a little bit negative, but it basically means that something else is prompting that need. Whereas accessibility is just planning for everyone from the get-go, which sounds a lot like UDL, right? Universal design for learning. It's really designing from the get-go with all learners in mind. So when we're thinking of accommodations to support accessibility or to remove barriers for accessibility, they usually fall into these 4 categories, which is the information presentation, characteristics of the setting, timing and scheduling, and student response requirements. So information presentation, if we think back to the UDL component, that multiple means of what? Presentation, right? And then characteristics of the setting, it's all environmental, timing and scheduling of instruction, executive functioning tools, and then student response requirements, right? That text-to-speech, speech-to-text, video response as opposed to a written response. Instead of an oral presentation for a student who's presenting with anxiety through selective mutism, maybe allowing them to record privately or to write it out. So again, those different modes of allowing the student to respond and communicate are important as we are building our capacity and moving towards a more inclusive setting. With that in mind, we're going to go back to our friend Dan to see where he takes us next on his search for inclusive education for his son, Samuel.
Now, luckily, Sam was a charmer. So, and a bit of a flirt. So in preschool, that wasn't that difficult, right? He was completely included in preschool. He belonged, no doubt. In elementary school, he was fully included in general education classrooms. He was supported, sometimes quite literally, by an expanding circle of friends. He belonged in that general education classroom, there was no doubt. He joined the Scouts. He acted in school theater. When other kids were speaking their lines, Samuel used the communication device mounted on his wheelchair to speak his lines. And that was normal. That's what he'd been doing all day long with his peers in school. For him, that stage was a place where he belonged. Samuel is a big baseball fan, and he started playing baseball with T-ball right up through Coach Pitch League, and he loved it. And we loved watching the joy in his face. And then came the age where he was going to be in the league where kids are pitching the ball quite fast, where kids are actually hitting the ball over the fence at times. And he wanted to play. So I thought, oh my gosh, how is he going to play at this level? And I remember getting together with the league president and saying, Joe, listen, Samuel wants to play in this level. I don't really know what that's going to look like. You know, should we send a letter home to families? Should we make this statement about inclusion? Should we have some communication throughout the league? And he said, Dan, slow down. Listen, if a kid in our community wants to play baseball, he's going to play baseball. End of story. I just said, wow, that's all I could ask for. So he played. Oh yeah, he played. He would get up there, he'd hit the ball off the tee when the other kids were playing, hitting off a pitch. He would go like a bat out of hell down that first base line in his bicycle with a little help from a coach. If he was out, he was out. If he was safe, he was safe. He was playing baseball. He belonged on that field. Now in middle school, Samuel has a great circle of friends in 8th grade. He's in general education in all his classes, and he's on the honor roll. Now, if you're surprised by that he's on the honor roll, don't be. Because Samuel represents the statistics that we have built over 35 years around inclusive education. The statistics have shown that kids with disabilities who are included in general education classrooms have better outcomes socially, academically, in terms of behavior, in terms of post-school outcomes, in terms of everything you can imagine. Advocate for inclusive education in your communities and schools. Advocate for inclusive education.
We heard from Dan talk about Samuel's experience from preschool to elementary school to joining Little League to middle school. What stands out in Dan and Samuel's journey towards inclusion? And Lupita will be monitoring the chat for me. Please use the chat to reflect.
I think the biggest thing that stood out to me is the community that was built, and he was able to travel with that community so that he had a strong support system that didn't see him as different, but just part of their community.
Thank you so much for sharing. I think the first time I watched this video, my biggest takeaway was how, and I have to really watch how I say this because I want to do it justice, right? So when Samuel was allowed to play, right? When he was allowed, because we know that's real. Sometimes we'll come across places where it's like, oh yeah, well, we don't know how to work with students with X, Y, or Z. This was not the case, and it makes me think of a couple of things, as you mentioned. He's been growing up in that community. He's been fostering this community of friends, of peers, of all these different people that that Samuel has known, that Dan has known. Clearly, he knew the coach well if they were on a first-name basis. So this level of relationship building, of community building, was already in place. But also how fluidly he was provided with a T for batting accommodation. The league was accessible to him. He was allowed to play, but he still required accommodations. That T, his sport chair, and that support from the assistant coach or parent or whoever that person was that was helping push him. And it makes me wonder about all, because it sounds simple, right? But it makes me wonder of all the behind the scenes work that this family, that this coach, that this community had to do to make it happen. Because oftentimes I feel that there's this pressure to make it happen like this, quickly, right? But it's a process. And recognizing that is also incredibly valuable in making the push towards inclusion. Because the last thing we want is to hear, well, that didn't work, right? Oh, yeah, inclusion doesn't work. If we take the time to consider all of the moving pieces that are at play, it really helps us be more prepared to take an iterative process towards creating those more inclusive environments, settings, and practices. So, is there a comment, Lupita?
There's a couple of comments that I think are share worthy as well.
Okay.
So evidently there's widespread support within the community. His peers and community were ready for it. It was an expectation, not an exception. Positive and proper resources, especially communication and opportunities, are so important in helping our students with inclusion advocacy to make it happen with no excuses, lots of community partnerships. I think, and I'll stop there just because of time, and I know we're due for a brain break. The common thread here is communication partnerships, communication partnerships, communication partnerships. We're not even talking about the specifics, which you mentioned, the specific accommodations, but it all begins with communication and partnerships.
Thank you for sharing that, Lupita. Thank you, Zoom participants, for continuing to engage with us via the chat and the Q&A. So let's go ahead and break for 5 minutes. It's 10:31. We'll see you back at 10:36 for our final segment before lunch, so you can start planning what it is that you're going to be having for lunch with your friends, or if you're at home, time to check that fridge to see what's available. See you back in 5 minutes. Okay, so I really appreciate these breaks because it allows me to connect with our participants and also to process additional points that come up, because I really do value everybody's feedback, and that also makes it important for us to engage in reflective conversations that might not happen otherwise. So a couple of things that I want to touch upon are, number one, we've been talking about inclusion and accessibility, and accommodations, and sharing Dan and Sam's example in their journey towards inclusion. And that begs a lot of questions and a lot of points that have come up that are incredibly valuable. And one of them is the full spectrum of the dimensions of identity, right? So what if Samuel were an English learner? What might that look like? Who might else be involved? So we know that players in this situation with Dan and his family are Dan, clearly his wife, Sam's teachers, his case manager, his coaches, but who else might be involved if Samuel were an English learner? And here's where we would tap into our ELD friends, our ELD TOSAs, our ELD teachers, our community liaisons. If Samuel's parents did not speak the language that his case managers did, if the home language was one that was different. So all of these considerations are super important. I really appreciate everybody sharing that, because sometimes we need the space to process and to think about particular situations. Another point that was shared is considering additional disabilities, right? So when we are looking at including a student with perhaps an emotional disturbance, that presents additional challenges. When we consider dimensions of identity, we talked about gender, we talked about race, and we have to stop and consider that these elements might play a part in how it is that we approach inclusivity. Should they play a role? Well, ideally, no, but we'd be very much missing the mark in addressing this wraparound whole child approach if we didn't consider those implications to the inclusion journey also. We know that a lot of our students who qualify for services under OHI for ADHD might pose additional challenges for a situation where perhaps the expectation of following routines, structures, sitting for long periods of time, just ways that might challenge how it is that their disabilities manifest, is going to be also part of the discussion as we engage in this iterative process of inclusion. Another point that came up that was important to consider and for us to reflect upon and address is that sometimes when we're considering what works for a particular student group doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to work for every single student. So for example, we talked about English learners not being a monolithic group. Same thing with our students with disabilities. Like Lupita mentioned, one of the lines that I often say is, if you've met one student with autism, you've met one student with autism, right? None of them are carbon copies of each other. They have different sensory impacts to how it is that they engage with their environment. So what might work for one child with autism isn't necessarily going to work for another one with autism, right? So to say like, oh, okay, well, because they do have some sensory issues, everybody's going to get a squishy. That might not work. That might not work for that student. Great intentions just won't work for everyone. Might not work every day for the same student, right? So just keeping that in mind. And the same holds true for technology. I know that some school sites have very strict rules related to technology. I know that, so for example, in the conversation that I shared earlier, where my husband and I talk about technology, it's very specific to his work site. I know that some school sites, some LEAs, some districts have a strict no cell phone policy. So again, bear in mind that it's going to vary from classroom to classroom, from teacher to teacher, from school to school, from district to district, from county to county. And guess what? Even from lesson to lesson, to activity to activity. So considering that some of the examples that we're sharing are that and that only, examples and considerations, and are in no way a recommendation as to what everybody should be doing, because that goes completely against what we're preaching here, which is individualizing supports for individual students. So thank you for sharing great feedback in the Zoom, and appreciate the opportunity to reflect and delve a little bit deeper in this work. Because even though we're talking in generalities here, general accessibility strategies, we know that it goes back to UDL, adjusting to unanticipated or impromptu developments, designing for students who have a variety of disabilities, designing accessible work, just making it accessible. All of these considerations, all of these points for reflection. Doesn't mean that you're going to do all of them at once. Doesn't mean that you're going to do all of these for the entire length of the day. But again, if you plan ahead with all of this in mind, which is UDL, we are able to provide a more accessible environment with the appropriate accommodations that will then support a more inclusive setting. So we've been talking about accommodations, and we know that all accommodations aren't necessarily academic. In Samuel's case, he was able to use the T to bat. He was able to use his sports wheelchair. However, one of the big areas that a lot of our students, those dually identified and not, is executive functioning. Executive functioning is huge, and it's responsible for many skills, including paying attention, organizing, planning, prioritizing, starting tasks, committing to tasks, understanding different points of view, regulating emotions, and self-monitoring, keeping track of what you're doing. And if you're a person with any level of ADHD, whether it be diagnosed or not, adult ADHD or here, it's all of them. It's all of them. Funny story I like to share is I was finishing up some coursework as I'm working towards my master's in adapted physical education. And Lupita asked me, like, hey, Vanessa, did you finish your project? Because I was stressing, oh my goodness, I have this project, blah, blah. And then I'm like, nope, but I planted a garden. So, like I have all these things to do, but I just can't, and I start, but then I go do something else so I can avoid doing the one thing because I've conditioned myself to believe that I work best last minute, right? Whether it's true or not, I don't know if I've already trained myself to make it true, but all of these manifestations of executive functioning deficits are definitely part of my day and impact my day. How I prepare, how I produce, how I engage, how I communicate. And this also applies to our students. So making sure that we have accommodations that are helpful to them, not just in academic settings, but also in organizing and planning for the learning that's going to take place during the day is critical. So let's circle back to day one, because I want to wrap it up nicely with a little bow by revisiting these previously shared tools. So last time, day one, we shared this document. And this document was modified from a resource shared at the California Assessment Conference, which is based on the work of CAST on UDL. And it's aligning accessibility resources that we typically use for assessment. So those of us familiar with the IEP process, we know that we select universal tools, designated supports, accommodations for statewide assessment, the LPAC and the SBAC. And we go through a list of these accessibility resources. And what this document did is it arranged them with the UDL guidelines, right? Multiple means of representation, multiple means of action and expression, and multiple means of engagement. So if you scan that QR code, or if you click on that bit.ly link or enter that bit.ly link into your browser, it'll pop open the PDF version of that document. So we're not necessarily going to engage with this tool right now, but know that it's there for you to support you in some reflection or group activity as part of your communities of practice, of your professional learning communities, where you can take some of these tools and consider the 4 scenarios that are shared with you up there. This document right here is the tool with the accessibility resources. But what is new to this session today is this document right here. So what it's going to do is it's going to pop it open, and it's this Google Doc in a PDF format that presents 4 situations. A student who gets distracted by noises in the hallway, a student who has a hard time copying information from the board, a student whose writing is at times illegible, and a student who misaligns numbers when working out addition, subtraction, multiplication. So if you take the document with the UDL guidelines aligned to the accessibility resources, and what these students might require, you can use this as an activity to map out those accessibility resources if you're trying to develop an inclusive setting for the student. Because really, what we're seeing here is, how I want you to look at this is the following way. These are different students that are pushing out into a gen ed setting. And if some of these learning behaviors manifested are significant enough for our gen ed counterparts to be like, you know what, it's just really hard to keep the student in class focused, because every time somebody passes by, like, they get distracted. So these conversations, these collaborative conversations as we build community around the student to best support them, need to happen, because then we need to start thinking, okay, if I truly want the student to be included in the class, what are some supports, what are some accommodations that we can brainstorm as a team to make it so that the student doesn't get distracted by hallway noise? And it could be a couple of things. It could be sensory, right? That the noises just make you turn. It could be environmental, that it's just the fact that you're by the door that's what makes you turn. But we won't know until we engage in these conversations, until we engage in some of these reflections to be able to make some recommendations. Oh, Mrs. So-and-so, thank you so much for sharing that. Aaron is super distracted by the noises that go out in the hallway. I'm gonna go and observe and I'm gonna see like what's going on with him. Oh, Mrs. So-and-so, like after I observed, I realized that he's right next to the door. So can we consider moving him to the other side of the classroom so that he'll be less distracted? Oh, you had already considered doing that? Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much for doing that. And also another thing, do you think it might be appropriate for him to X, Y, or Z? So again, having all of these considerations be part of your inclusion forward moving repertoire is important, because the last thing we want is not address these issues as they pop up and then have that get into the way of having our students fully included in a general education classroom, because then these learning behaviors manifested become behaviors, and then behaviors get in the way of inclusion. So just a nice little tool for you to take and use with your teams, by yourself, to be able to go towards inclusion, not just integration. Because the last thing we want is to push for the student who is perhaps having a hard time note-taking, right? Copying from the board in the previous example in that little sheet. And because they're having a hard time copying from the board, have to sit in the back with the aide and the aide scribing for them, because then they're not fully integrated, right? So how might we support the student so that they're fully included and not still just be a little island in the classroom? So share with me in the chat, how might we support a student who has a hard time copying from the board to push towards inclusion and not integration by sitting them with the aide in the back? What else might we do before having that human person next to them to support the task of taking notes? How might we do that? And friends here live, give us some of your suggestions.
By giving them a copy of the notes,
Perfect.
either
Giving them,
beforehand or afterhand, so that it's not noticeable.
yes.
Having it put on their Google Classroom.
Yes, yes,
They can paste it into their spiral.
yes. Great. So you gave me 3 in 1. She gave me 3 ways of supporting the student. She says, provide a printed copy. Absolutely. Have it available in Google Classroom. Yep. And then just have it taped into their spiral bound notebook. Do we do that only for that one student, or is it something that we make available for all students? Make it available for all students, right? Because if you make it available for all students from the get-go, it becomes not one thing to do for the one student. It's just there. It reminds me of, I visited a classroom like 10 years ago at High Tech High. And amazing experience, by the way, going there, blown away by so many things there. But one of the things that I remember the most is that there was a young man who was submitting an essay, and they were doing a peer, like a peer corrected feedback with the essay. And the young man's partner went to the teacher and very quietly said, like, I don't understand his writing, right? And the teacher said, okay, well, I want you to ask him, how might you help me be able to read this? So I was really curious, because one of my things was like, I don't think that I see any kids that have specialized supports right? Because in my mind, I had been trained to think of like accommodations as one thing that you do for everyone, right? For just those that need it. So it was never like something that you just do for everyone. So then these two young men engage in a conversation. Like, hey, he's like, dude, like, I like how can you help me read this? Because like I want to make sure I understand what you wrote. And the guy's like, oh, do you want me to type it? And the guy's like, yeah, I think that would help. So then he typed it. I'm talking about 10 years ago, right? Now it would be speech to text, right? All he would do would have to be to read his writing and this and that. But it just became something that wasn't like, no, like it has to be a paper pencil paragraph. Or it wasn't like, no, I'm sorry, like you already have to submit what you have. It was just such an open way of just making all of these tools available because everybody had access to that word processor if they wanted to. So thinking of how you said that to just make the notes available or to have them copied to their spiral bound or make them available electronically in Google Classroom, those are all great ways to consider making that classroom experience more inclusive so that it doesn't turn into a thing of like, well, they're falling behind because they're not keeping up with their notebook. They have an F on their notebook and like they're going to fail my class because the notebook is weighed heavily. So thinking of those different ways that we support inclusion in our gen ed settings for our students with disabilities who are or may not be dually identified is critical because there is not one way or one tool. There's multiple ways, but it's making sure that that's something that's available for whoever might need it is super important. Lupita, is there anything else in the chat?
It's basically in line with what was shared out loud. It's making me wonder just this topic, the concepts that we're discussing makes me wonder about how lessons are designed, how activities are designed and delivered. And I'm reminded of a comment from Kitty Novak, UDL Queen Guru, a friend, where she has had us thinking about outcomes versus output. And the way that I can explain it now, my understanding of that today is as we are designing lessons or providing supports or accommodations or thinking about how do I make this accessible or more inclusive, it's even broader than that. In other words, thinking about what is it that I want all of my learners to come away with? Is it copying notes or is it coming away with the gist or having a resource at hand, the notes, that they can refer to as we dive into the content? Because if it's the latter, then nobody should be copying notes, right? So again, it's the output is using the notes to come back to as a resource, as a learning resource. If that's the purpose, then the output, in other words, how the students are going to utilize it, has nothing to do with them copying it, other than just have it readily available so that they can use it for future learning. I hope that makes sense. It's just I really am being reflective and going back to opportunities for us as practitioners to think about making lessons and activities accessible through fresh eyes or a different lens.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because once we start reflecting on our own practice, previous practice, conversations, what have you, right? And considering all of the examples, not exemplars, examples that we're sharing with you. And even those examples are not exhaustive. Like we all have multiple experiences and just experiences, accommodations, all of these things in our pedagogical repertoire. It really makes me go back to the learning behaviors manifested that might get also in the way of inclusion and how we as practitioners can sort of be proactive in our approach towards inclusion by considering how might that be supported. So for example, the student who, as part of his participation in this general education class, must keep a notebook, okay? I'm not saying notebooks are bad, I'm not saying notebooks are good, I'm just saying that this is an example that I see often, right? The student must keep a notebook. The teacher can choose to do it in multiple ways. They can have an electronic notebook, they can have a copy and paste, note-taking, whatever. If the expectation is that the student is copying from the board, right, and the student has a disability, then that's different, right? Because now he might need very specific accommodations, especially if we're having issues related to visual motor coordination, right? Where that's a processing area of deficit. So when I'm talking about learning behavior manifested, right, it might look like he doesn't complete his notebook. Okay? And that can be read many ways. Unfortunately, most of the times is non-compliance. He's not compliant with his notebook. Or he's the L word, he's lazy, right? Can be interpreted many ways. And if our gen ed counterpart isn't aware that a visual motor processing deficit exists, that's where communication and collaboration comes in. Like, hi, you know, like I noticed he has an F in your class, and I know that there's like a lot of weight on the notebooks, but let me share with you, like, I don't know if I was really detailed with you when we were going through his IEP, the IEP at a glance, but, you know, Aaron has a visual processing deficit and also visual motor coordination issues. So what that means is that it's really hard for him to look up at the board, read what's there, find it, read it, and then find where he left off in his notebook, and then copy that down. It's just really hard for him, like the way that they process information and the way his brain communicates what he sees, what he understands from what he sees, and how it's provided as written output. That's really, really, really hard. That paints that learning behavior manifested in a very different light. So sometimes, and I really appreciate all the feedback in the Zoom chat and also here in the room related to communication, collaboration, that connectedness is really important because that really will help that general education teacher understand, like, oh, right, okay, what can we do? And that's where the collaborative spirit kicks in, which is critical to inclusion. Yes, absolutely. You just want to get steps in too.
On that note, one thing that I noticed, I'm doing push-in this year, and I noticed the English teacher actually, she had a very wordy handout, and we had this particular student who gets very overwhelmed. So I came in and I shared with her a short version of it. So she's like, oh, well, you know what? I have something similar. So she realized that she already has the resources. She's just not using it, or she wasn't using it. And now she's just like the guy with the ramp. She decided to use it for all. And it's like the flow of the lessons, they're like much more smoother. I mean, they already have the resources, and I guess, like you just said, they need an outside person or a new set of eyes to let them know that they already have those tools. They just need to be reminded that it works for all. So, yeah, thank you.
Intentionality is what
Right.
comes to mind.
Yeah, and that is so important to point out, right? That, again, had you not been engaging in push-in, you wouldn't have noticed that to make that observation, right? And what is that push-in component? Collaboration, communication, right? So it's really the basis for inclusive environments and practices, right? Being aware of what's there. And like, as you mentioned, now it's a resource that's available for all students, right? And it's helped the instruction and it's helped the learning. So we talked a lot about academics, we talked about executive functioning, but also we know that providing social emotional supports for students who are dually identified, and even for those that are not, just considering dimensions of identity, right? We need to really provide opportunities for our students through inclusive environments to connect with their peers, to have interactions, so that we can promote inclusion. And this can't happen if we continue having just practices that aren't necessarily conducive to a very free-flowing, natural opportunity to be included, right? That doesn't seem overly produced, that is structured, that is not necessarily structured for a quote-unquote artificial interaction, but that it's more part of just the way things are done here, right? So again, engaging in appropriate social emotional opportunities to connect with peers is important, because then that in turn allows us to be more culturally and linguistically sustaining in our pedagogy, so that we create these opportunities for students to connect. And with that, I want to take us back to the visual about inclusive education. We talked about moving from exclusion through separation to integration, and then finally to inclusion. And how will we know when we're there? Well, successful inclusive education happens primarily through accepting, understanding, and attending to student differences and diversity, which can include physical, cognitive, academic, social, and emotional. That's not to mention the dimensions of identity as well. So as we move towards full inclusion, towards a practice of just having it be the way things are done, not as something that is available just during lunchtime for our circle of friends club, right? That is actually happening consistently throughout the day is going to be important. And what you might have in place locally in your classroom, in your school site, in your district, is going to be a means of starting. It's a starting point. And when I want us to consider what we do for inclusive practices, I want to give you credit for what you're already doing, because sometimes it can be a challenge. And we all start where we can. The important part is starting. And what might my next steps be? Who might I need to reach out to? Who could support my work? Where do I need to go to build more resources, to access more resources, to connect with others that might support this journey? Are there pockets of excellence already existing in my area where I could potentially learn? And if you're already on the right track, give yourself a pat on the back, because sometimes it can feel like we're constantly going towards a moving target and that what we are doing is not enough. But I want you to stop and consider all of the different things you do in your day to make our students' experiences all that more linked towards inclusion and developing that sense of belonging. So we're going to pick up with Dan. And see where we go next in his journey with developing a nice
college when he can't
supportive
even hold
environment for Samuel.
It's also important to look at the flip side of this, of a different story. And this is a story about a boy named Todd. Todd was a kid that I got to know early in my years as a photojournalist when I did a documentary story on mainstreaming kids with disabilities into general ed. It was almost like an experiment back then. Let's just try this and see how it works. Well, Todd flourished in elementary school. He was with his peers, they got to know him. The problem was, as he got older, adults particularly, even in middle school and high school, kept talking to him like he was a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old because he had cerebral palsy and couldn't speak and couldn't walk. At times, his mother told me they would just pat him on the head as a teenager. They would make promises about things they were going to do that went unfulfilled. Todd went through high school that way, pretty much being treated like a little kid. Finally, at about age 20, he got access to some communication technology that allowed him to express his thoughts and feelings. You know what one of the first things he said was? He said it a little more colorfully than that. And it's funny, but it's very sad that all this anger had been built up over these years because Todd had been treated like a little kid when he was absorbing everything. He was understanding everything. But he didn't have that chance for a bar to be held high for him. Unfortunately, Todd is also representative of statistics. 56% of kids in this country with intellectual or developmental disabilities spend their entire day in self-contained, separate settings just for kids with disabilities, whether it's classes or separate schools. Even though we know, and all the research says, that that is not going to yield better outcomes for them. Advocate for inclusion. Advocate for inclusive education. So why do we continue to segregate kids at such a high rate when we know the statistics don't support it? Why do we do it? Well, we know that sometimes when you do things for a long time in society, it's hard to change, right? You just get into certain habits that this must be the way to do it. But I think about this all the time. What's it going to take to change that dynamic so that so many kids are not being segregated? And I've come to believe that maybe it's really not about Samuel or Todd. Maybe it's not primarily about them. Maybe it's actually about the other kids. Maybe we need to show that inclusion benefits typical kids without disabilities as much or more than they benefit Samuel or Todd. The truth is that there are all these research studies that are being done at universities that show academic benefits for typical kids who are learning in inclusive settings. And there's one particular study that was done at Vanderbilt where they did 2 groups of kids they studied. One group were in an inclusive environment alongside their peers with disabilities. One group was separated from their peers with disabilities. The group that worked alongside their peers with disabilities had an average of a 15-point increase in their academic achievement. And what they did is they figured out why that happened. And it was because when you're working collaboratively with a peer, with a friend, with somebody who might need a little extra assistance or some coaching, you're much more engaged in the curriculum. You want to understand it, you want to study it. So those kids were so engaged because they had this friend that they wanted to make sure that they were a good collaborator with. So they achieved at a higher rate. But let's look beyond academics. Academics are important, very important. But some of my favorite moments in Samuel's life and in my life were the walks to school each morning. Because that's where you get little glimpses of the conversations that happen among kids, right? Or you see those little rituals that go on, or the games that are played, or those little stories from home. Honestly, when I think back to school, I think I remember the walks to school more than I remember school itself. So, that's obviously critical, that those extra parts of life that go beyond the classroom. So let me ask you another question. When you think about who you are today as a person, and I don't mean just professionally, I mean your hobbies, your passions, your relationships, everything, which of these 2 factors had a bigger impact on your life? Was it the academic experience of school, or was it the social and emotional experience of school? So we'll do a quick poll. How many of you say the academic experience of school had a bigger impact on who you are today? There's no wrong answer, I swear. Okay, 1, 2, okay. We've got 3 or 4 people. How many of you say the social and emotional experience of school had a greater impact? About 95% of the room. But we measure schools almost solely by how they do academically by kids. When all of you have just told me that the social and emotional experience of school was, for most of you, more important. So I'll give you a real-time illustration of this point. Samuel and 2 of his friends, Jacob and Fletcher, and I took a great road trip to the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York this summer.
Thoughts? So we heard about Samuel. We learned about Todd, what Todd's experience was like. His communication device finally at age 20. We heard about some of the research statistics we heard again from Dan the difference between the academic experience and that social experience, talking about those walks to school and what we remember from school. Is it the lessons or is it the social emotional aspect of it? And in no way am I saying that, grades are important or academics aren't important. But in the grand scheme of things, the human experience, what are some thoughts that come to mind, considering all we've walked through today, processed today, and Dan and Samuel's experience, and Todd's experience? What are some thoughts?
Start in the chat.
Yeah.
I love this and have been preaching this for years. The one group of students I honestly have difficulty with in terms of pushing inclusion are students with severe behaviors that create fear in peers. What are your thoughts?
Okay, I like that. So yes. So I teach a class at one of the universities at Azusa Pacific, and one of the conversations that we have is on how do we build an environment that is inclusive for students with emotional disturbance, because they are typically our hardest students to place in a gen ed setting because of challenging behaviors. So for me, the number one thing, having worked with students with emotional disturbance as well, is having the art of self-regulation down packed. And I'm talking about me, the adult. When I'm beginning to feel triggered by certain behaviors, and I hate using that word triggered because of the connotation in popular culture, but when I start feeling that my buttons are getting pushed, let's put it that way, by a behavior, or that I'm being challenged, I had to really develop a sense of pulling myself away from the situation and focusing in on the behavior and not the relationship. It had nothing to do with the student and me personally, okay? That's the first thing, and that takes a lot of skill. And I had to build that skill by putting in scaffolds for myself. And I share that with you as a group, again, as an example, not exemplar, of how I did it. So when I was a very young teacher, I started at 23, I think, and, well, very young to me. But when that started happening, I just would turn around and go to my filing cabinet. My filing cabinet was my friend as I was building my skill set in regulating, self-regulating myself to support the student in co-regulating those challenging behaviors. So I would turn and I'd be like, I'll be right with you. And I'm practicing my breathing, and I would turn around and I would pull my filing cabinet and I would file through 10 folders. And that's how I kept count of 10. And it wasn't looking to the student like they were getting a rise out of me, because we know that sometimes there are students with emotional disturbance, that's part of what keeps them going also, right? Because if I would have been like, okay, I'm giving him feedback, right? So I was like, pull whatever 10th folder that was. It could be anything, and be like, okay, I'm sorry, what were you saying? And after they had told me to F off and everything, right? So it gave me a chance to be calm, and it gave them a chance to also sort of like recognize that this pattern of behavior wasn't going to continue to be fed into, and finally an opportunity to co-regulate with him, right? Was it always successful? No, but nothing ever is 100% successful 100% of the time. So and building that relationship with our gen ed counterparts to support and include our students with challenging behaviors, it's important to share with them strategies that we use to self-regulate so that we can then co-regulate with the student. Because some of our students do not have the necessary skills to figure out what's happening or how to calm down. And unfortunately, telling people to calm down doesn't make them calm down, right? So, yes. Or don't cry, right? It's like.
I just wanted to speak a little bit on that because I guess I was originally wanting to be a gen ed teacher, and I started working for the need of a job at a non-public school in Compton, where I was with high school. I had a 10th through 12th grade, 11th grade in my class, and they were all emotionally disturbed with other eligibilities on top of that. And one of, aside from teaching them, how to regulate and all that good stuff, but the biggest thing was relationship. And I've seen in all the settings that I work with, and I work with a lot of emotional disturbed as well, is that they don't care what you know until they know how much you care. And so you have to build relationship with them. You have to check in with them. How was your day today? Like, I know at a previous district, we use for the littles the zones of regulation, like what zone are you in today? How can I help you? And then that gives you an insight, like if they, pop off or if they're on one, it's because don't take it personal. It's because they miss their mom, or they haven't seen their mom for a week, or they're having a rough time, or it's a rough day. And so then it's like, after you pre-teach, like, okay, I see that, you're dysregulated. Let's go to your toolbox. So what do you need? Breaths. What do you need? Go to a calm down corner. Go take a walk, but all of that comes in handy. The pre-teaching, they already know what to do once they're dysregulated. But it is very much, I will preach, is definitely the social emotional learning is key, and the relationship building is pivotal. And I think of it, actually, my husband told me a book that he read, which is like change in your pocket. Like you deposit. So when it's time to withdraw, they don't take it personal because you've deposited so much that there's money in there for you to withdraw from. So yeah,
I
just want to share
love that. I love that. Thank you so much. That's going to be added to my reading list now, because it's absolutely true. So I wanted to go back to something you shared about what's in your toolkit for the student, right? How do you know what's in that toolkit if you haven't worked through it with your student, right? So some of our students don't even know what they might need in that toolkit. And how might we help them develop what those tools are is through relationships also, and observation. So I had a student who again, many issues going on top of the documented disability, but for her, music was very helpful to calm down. So our school had a very strict, I'm talking about 15 years ago maybe, very strict policy on headphones. Like students couldn't be wearing headphones. I mean, obviously if they're listening to like, back in the day it was like a book on tape or like whatever it was, you could, or if you were connecting it to the computer, like that was fine. But as far as like a student bringing like a Discman or an MP3 player or an iPod back in the day, like it was just not allowed. So did I let that stop me? No, right? Because I knew that that was something super helpful to her. Super helpful, and it kept her from tossing that desk when she was frustrated. So again, was that something that I decided just on the spot? Yeah, but there were steps attached to it, right? I built a relationship with her. I observed her. I tried different things. Some things failed. Some things worked. But then I was able to point out that this is a consistent tool that supports her. After I had all that data collection, I was able to approach my administrator because guess what? During observation time, if they walk in and she's bopping to her her iPod back in the day, or I think she had a Zune, was like those little music players. You know, they would have a heads up as to why that was happening. And that was supportive for her. It was something helpful. And when I was finally convinced that she was ready to join the gen ed environment with that support for when she had to focus on difficult tasks, then we were able to work on a phasing in plan to have her participate in a gen ed environment with those academic supports. Because imagine what would have happened if I still sent her in for mainstreaming time with the behavior unchecked of throwing desks when she got frustrated, with an MP3 player and a headset. My gen ed friend would have said, I am your friend no more, right? So a lot of work, but worthy work. Lupita, anything else in the chat?
So here's a comment with a question. I have found that at my school, many teachers are so overwhelmed by their workload in gen ed that while they may agree to these accommodations and means to create inclusivity, they couldn't actually put it to use in their classroom because they are already stretched so thin. How can we create a system that supports the staff, also including disabled staff, in order to support the students? I'm going to just start and then I'm going to tag it over to you. It really is a matter of choice. And again, what we are discussing, what we are recommending, the examples that we offer are to be taken into your very specific context. So when I say that it's a matter of choice, it's a matter of thinking about what is it that is going to give me the best outcome. And I'm going to go back to the example of writing down the notes, right? That takes some time. That takes time to write the notes down for the purpose of using or creating a resource that I'm going to tap into for learning later. So if I'm going to put myself in the gen ed teacher who is feeling overwhelmed, which is very real. I want to validate that. And I'm being offered a couple of strategies to implement to support a couple of students that are in the, let's call it a push-in model. But, I need to make sure that they copy the notes from the board. So again, it goes back to a matter of choice and really reflecting on how might this accommodation, this recommendation by, my special education colleague for these couple of students benefit my entire class. And if I come to the conclusion that, okay, maybe I don't have them write down the notes, maybe I create a note-taking guide that students can fill in based on the information that they need, maybe work collaboratively with each other. And now I have time, right? I'm not sitting there waiting or getting frustrated with the kiddos who are not completing their notes quickly or effectively. So again, not a cookie cutter recommendation, but it's making me reflect on what is it that is making me feel so stretched thin, and how are those things having an impact on learning or not? And might I be able to, what I call cut the fat, take them off of my plate so that I can incorporate some best practices that are going to be beneficial for all of my students, although they are specifically designed for students with disabilities or English learners with disabilities or both. And I'm going to tag it to you because I see your brain thinking.
Yeah, you see my wheels spinning. So, a couple of things. Again, relationships, right? So I absolutely want to validate and affirm the fact that a lot of our teachers are feeling stretched thin. Overworked, and they're feeling responsible for many initiatives. And again, going back to my personal experience, I see it with my own husband, who's a general education teacher at a high school. So absolutely. So part of that relationship would then be, I would start with a conversation. Okay, like, thank you for sharing that you're feeling overwhelmed and that you haven't been able to incorporate all of the accommodations that we talked about. But at this moment in time, what can we do? Like where can we start? Because I always say, one is better than none, right? And it also shows the ability for us to come together and have these open conversations, because that teacher put themselves in a position of vulnerability by telling you, you know what, I'm feeling unprepared, or I'm feeling overwhelmed, or I'm feeling X, Y, or Z, whatever it might be. But if you've put change into that relationship with the student and with the teacher and with all of the peers that you connect with, then we can have those conversations. So that would be one of the things, right? What can we do? Where can we start? How do we get going to get to the to incorporating all of the accommodations that might be successful, right? Or maybe you give some insight. You know what? The one that's going to give you the most results is this one. Let's do this one. So just having that conversation is important. The other thing that I want to touch on, as Lupita was speaking, it really made me think about how it is that we connect with students as well. A lot of times our students just don't have the way of articulating what works for them, and it's helping them work through it and asking those coaching questions. Okay, when you're feeling stuck in your social studies class, like, what do you think might help you better, right? And I'm talking about that in my perspective as a parent, because just recently we had an IEP for my son, and I've included him in those IEPs since he was little. And I thought having been a teacher, I thought his case manager and I had come up with brilliant accommodations, right? And my son's sitting there and he's like, no, I don't like that one. That doesn't help. And I was like, no, but it's because you struggle with organization and you could use, that doesn't work for me. I was like, okay, all right. Well-meaning. I picked out an area of deficit in executive functioning, which was organization. I thought a graphic organizer for his to-do list would be helpful. It just didn't work for him. We had to find another way. And he said, no, you know what works for me is a reminder on the phone. Okay. So there it wasn't prompted, right? Like, what do you think of these accommodations, or what do you think of these supports? But it was something that he shared in that moment. And again, like, a lot of this is truly dependent on that relationship building and that communication to support these inclusive practices. Okay, it's that time, lunchtime. So as promised, we want to give you a full 60 minutes to enjoy your lunch. It is 11:34. I'll throw in an extra minute. See you back at 12:35.
Actually, Vanessa,
Okay.
if I may, I've been telling folks that lunch is at 11:45, and to honor whatever task you've given yourself during lunch, hopefully it includes lunch, I want to be able to honor that hour starting at 11:45 because people have been asking. So
okay. See, Lupita's banking into that relationship. She's putting change in. 11:45 to 12:45 is the official lunch.
So please be back at 12:45 and drive safely. Thank you.
Folks, thank you. Hopefully you had a nice, long, extra long lunch. I know for many of us, an hour is already more than we get on a daily. So I hope that you were able to take care of your tasks and have a bite to eat in the process. So welcome back from lunch. As we round the corner in today's presentation, we want to circle back to this slide that I know you've seen at least a couple of times. Only this time it's a little different. I'm going to ask that you focus your attention to that second paragraph. And I'm going to read it and emphasize some of the terms that are highlighted and underlined there, because I wanted to set the tone to what we're going to be reviewing and discussing and sharing with you this latter part of the training. So successful inclusion education happens primarily through accepting, understanding, and attending to student differences and diversity, which can include physical, cognitive, academic, social, and emotional. I'm going to go back to the underlined words. Happens primarily through accepting, understanding, and attending. I have a story to share that involves feeling a sense of belonging in different educational contexts. So I'm an English learner. I learned English mostly, I think I became fluent probably by the time I was, between 6th and 8th grade. I feel that I became fluent in English around that time. And I went to school in a very small community where most of the students looked and spoke and were like me. Those socioeconomic, immigrant families, poor or dirt poor. So it was, I didn't feel, I had a true sense of belonging because everything was familiar. And then I get to high school and I get bused to high school. And it was a culture shock for me. By the time I was in 8th grade, I was a really good student. I was a pretty good student, getting good grades. I've learned English really well, et cetera, et cetera. However, when I got to high school, I really felt out of place. And as I reflect on why that was the case, I believe now, as an adult and in education, and doing this work, having done this work for decades now, I believe that the reason why I struggled academically, even though I had full capacity to ace my classes, if you will, but I struggled. I struggled academically because I didn't have a sense of belonging. I felt invisible in many of my classes. And back then they had the GATE classes, and I was in those classes. And there was such a gap between the kiddos, the students, who knew each other and were, I believe that it was a socioeconomic gap that I just could not fit in. Socioeconomically, there was this very obvious barrier between me and a couple of the other kids that were being bused in as well, and the rest of the students. Now, why am I sharing this story with you? Because I felt invisible. And I really believe that it wasn't because of something that I was doing or not doing. I really feel that I wasn't seen because I wasn't from that group. I didn't belong in that group. I wasn't invited into the group. And not one adult in my first year of high school, my freshman year of high school, not one adult, not even my counselor, noticed it, reached out, or addressed it. My grades were dropping very quickly. And, I picked them up later, but I had to work really, really hard in getting over that barrier for myself. And I can't give you the specifics of how or why it happened, but thank goodness it happened, right? Because I don't know if I would be standing here in front of you today if it hadn't. So it's important for us to consider a sense of belonging and the impact it has in education and the role that we play, every single person here today, myself including, and our friends in the Zoom room, that we play in helping students like me, when I was a freshman in high school, have a sense of belonging. So I borrowed this slide, actually reworked the slide a little bit, from one of my friends, Stephanie Coleman. Shout out to our friends, our UDL friends, also a special education resource lead, because it just really spoke to me. It spoke to me and it helped me share the story that I shared with you about me as a freshman in high school. Belonging is one of our basic human needs, and people who spend their energy attempting to ensure this need is met, have insufficient energy left for higher order thinking, focus, and execution of tasks. So when I read this, I thought, that's what happened to me. That's what happened to me in high school. That's why I couldn't progress. That's why instead of continuing to ace my classes and be that nerd, because that's what I was called in junior high, I was the nerd, all of a sudden I was that failing student. That failing student who gets bussed in, from that little school over there, and typical, right? Typical. But I wasn't. But I recognized that because I didn't have a sense of belonging, and because the environments in which I was engaging in or trying to engage in, my classes, and the adults did not notice that. And because they didn't know me, maybe they didn't even look at my CUME folder or my previous grades, because they didn't know me, I believe that they thought I was a typical kid from that little school over there. That's what I believe. So it's important for us to recognize that we need to really begin to understand who our kiddos are outside of their academics, right? Because my academics at my freshman year of high school did not reflect the student that I truly was. And I believe in my heart that it's because I did not have this sense of belonging for different reasons. I want you to take a moment now and think about what you personally need to feel a sense of belonging. Take a moment to drop a word or a phrase in the chat. If you're here with us, write it down. Think about, what do you need to feel a sense of belonging? And if this question makes you think about a memory, then focus on that. So I'll be quiet for just a few seconds and we'll give you a moment to think about this. What do you need to feel a sense of belonging? Think about a time where you didn't have the sense of belonging, and what did that remind you of? What was missing? And let me know when you see some streams of words in the chat.
So much good stuff. So much good stuff in the chat. Relationships, welcoming, acceptance, basically everything in the wheel. But as I'm doing a quick survey, welcomed is probably the most often occurring one. Connections, warmth. So a lot of those dimensions of belonging.
How about our friends in the room here? We just shouted out. What helps you feel like you belong here, that you're welcomed? Anything different from what we heard in the Zoom or the wheel? Needed, heard, involved. So having a sense of, I have something to contribute. Even though I don't speak English, I can contribute. Even though I'm in a wheelchair, I can contribute. Even though I don't speak English very well, I'm included. I'm being asked questions. I'm being invited. So these are things that are kind of personal, right? But they impact learning. They impact learning. We learn so much. We begin to learn based on our environment. Walking into a room, a classroom, I can begin to feel whether I am going to have a sense of belonging or not by what's there or what's not there in a staff meeting, in an IEP meeting, in an SST meeting. The context, that environment, the way that it's designed and organized, before anybody starts speaking, my eyes, my ears are picking up on whether or not I'm welcomed and I'm invited, or if I am going to have a sense of belonging. So the environment is critical, instrumental in giving our learners, whether children or adults, the sense of belonging, and whether or not I need to focus my energy on, belonging or my energy on learning. I have a resource here, and actually for the next few slides, the next part of our session today is going to be focusing on resources, on tangible resources that you can take with you, implement for yourself, your colleagues, staffs, departments, however you feel is the most feasible next step in terms of using these resources. The first resource that I want to share with you is this one, Dimensions of Belonging. It's a self-reflection tool, but really by design, it's designed for groups, for teams. It's going to let me make a copy. It's slow. So if you can pop it open for me, please. We're going to spend a little bit of time becoming familiar with the resources that I'm going to be sharing with you today. So when you pop it open, you'll see a table. And the table has those dimensions of belonging that we saw on the wheel in the previous slide. Present. Are students involved in and in all the same spaces and activities as their peers? What are we doing really well right now in this area? What could we be doing better or different in this area? And the next element of the wheel is invited. Is the presence and participation of students actively sought out and encouraged by others at their school? Is it happening really well? Or is there room for improvement? So you get the gist. So the left side of this table are those elements around that wheel of belonging, and then some space for reflecting. So I'm going to ask you for two things. I'm going to ask you to become familiar with this resource, and as you're becoming familiar with this resource, meaning read through the description for each one of those elements in that belonging wheel. And I pretty much guarantee that you're going to be thinking either about your classroom or your office or whatever your role is. You're going to be thinking about it as you're reading those elements. And if you feel so, if you have the need to, go ahead and jot down some notes for yourself. But really the whole purpose here is for you to become familiar with this resource. So that's one thing. Become familiar with the resource. And then think about who might you want to share this with for the purpose of beginning to have a dialogue around how do we begin to implement strategies to help all learners, adults including, not just talking about students here, right? Adults including, to have a sense of belonging, right? So let's put about, what do you say, Vanessa, 3 minutes on the clock? Let's do 3 minutes on the clock. Become familiar with the resource for yourself. Perhaps even think about how does this apply to my current context, classroom, office, staff, whatever. And then number two, who might you want to share this with for the purpose of taking an actionable next step? So two outcomes, 3 minutes on the clock. I'd like to hear from a few of you. Who might you want to share this resource with for the purpose of collectively taking an actionable next step? Who do you want to share it with? Okay, your coaches, your administrators. Anything in the chat, Vanessa?
Yes, administrators, teacher teams, individuals we're collaborating with, your gen ed collaborators, coaches, basically everyone.
Basically everyone. So I think about some conversations that you've shared with us in the chat, in person. Vanessa and I like to eavesdrop on your conversations amongst yourself. And one of the things that has been surfacing is the role of general education teachers in general, right? I hate to make blanket statements about any group, but in the context of this training and the topics that we've been visiting and revisiting, the role of general education when it comes to collaborating, right? So I'm thinking about the sense of belonging, right? And although we mostly have been talking about students, I want to reiterate that this particular resource can be utilized for adults as well, right? So I'm going to speak for myself as a general education teacher with a background of a deep knowledge and understanding and experience in supporting through the lens of English learners. And I'm coming into this grant work, right? Special education. Wait, I don't have any training. I don't have any experience. I was beginning to feel a little bit overwhelmed myself. Like, am I going to be able to learn the terminology? You know, how am I going to be able to speak to special education? I'm not a special education teacher. I don't have the certification. I don't have the training. And so I started to kind of unravel a little bit, right? Having this deep sense of responsibility in providing training and support and resources for all things English learner, when I was invited to participate in this grant, it was the first time that I was asked to kind of stretch in a way that I had nothing to connect to, right? So think about that when if you're a special education teacher, think about that when you are reaching out to your general education staff and you may get some pushback. It may be because there isn't this sense of belonging, like that's not my wheelhouse. I don't have the training. I'm gonna get it wrong. I don't even go to, professional development for special education, the training that special education teachers go to. I'm not making excuses, folks. Let me be clear. What I'm saying is that in order for me and you and students to be able to use their energy and their resources and all the tools that we bring to the table as learners to help us take the next step forward, to progress academically, to fill knowledge gaps, we need to have a sense of belonging, right? It goes the same with special education, right? I can tell you that when I was focusing solely on English learners, I rarely saw special education teachers in my training. So to say, hey, SPED teachers, how come you're not implementing comprehensive ELD? How come you don't know about the ELD standards? They're EL learners, you should, right? I could do the whole wag the finger thing, but I'm not, and I don't, because I understand that the way that our system is designed is this is your lane, this is my lane, and we can go parallel, but let's not cross. Let's not have our lanes cross. What Vanessa and I have been saying and hopefully modeling, the design of our team, is that our lanes must cross. Sometimes I need to go into your lane, right? And tell me a little bit more about this accommodation and how's it going to impact assessment? Oh, it's not. Oh, okay. Can you show me how to do that? Because I have an idea of how to do it, but I don't know how to do it with a kiddo who is, manifesting behaviors that I'm just not familiar with. And sometimes Vanessa has to come into my lane. Can you tell me a little bit more about designated ELD and what does that look like for a student, on the autism spectrum? So it's important for us to recognize that these lanes are important and we need them. Sometimes we refer to them as silos. But it's also important for those lanes to cross, to build bridges between those silos. And a lot of the times, maybe not every time, but a lot of the times it begins with, what's my role here? I don't want to overstep my boundaries, right? Or I don't even want to try to do it because I don't want to get it wrong. So again, it's mindsets. Sometimes it's so ingrained in the culture that that's just how we do it here. You do you, I do me, and never do the lanes cross. But again, we're talking about human elements here, from kiddos all the way to adults. So it's something that I want to share with you that is going to help support this mindset of inclusive practices in the classroom, in your meetings, and in establishing those relationships that need to happen in order for us to be able to truly address the needs of our dually identified students, our English learners with disabilities. We need to work together, right? We need to lean on each other. And it begins with building those relationships. And obviously, this sense of belonging. Yes, Vanessa.
So I just want to highlight this beautiful comment here. So as you were talking about lanes and, sometimes connecting, crossing over, merging, Carl chimed in with a gem. Merging takes a lot of patience. Moreover, confidence need to be built. So I just said that's beautiful, needs to be on a t-shirt, and I'd buy it. But really it's spot on. A lot of patience, a lot of practice, a lot of trust if we're going to be merging in and out of each other's lanes, but at the end knowing that the destination is well worth it.
Right, and also recognizing our sphere of influence, but guess what? You do have influence. Maybe your sphere is not as big as you want it to be, but you do have an influence. You absolutely can have an impact within your sphere of influence. If that sphere of influence is your classroom, if the sphere of influence is a colleague in your department, or maybe, that one teacher that's not even in your grade level, right? But you do have influence, and you do contribute to the system that exists, whether it's good, bad, or ugly, based on your perception, perspective. You do contribute to that same system by either engaging or not engaging. So again, I'm going to get off my little soapbox for a little bit here, but again, it's important to take into consideration that this particular resource is designed for all learners, including the adults. So as we move forward and you're listening to us talk, you're digging into the resources that we're sharing, think about your colleagues as well. Think about the colleagues across the hallway if you're special education, general education, if you're general education, special education, and because the topic is around English learners with disabilities, your EL TOSAs, your EL coaches, your EL directors and leads who are responsible for ensuring that all of your English learners, including your English learners with disabilities, are receiving those required EL services described in Title III. Okay, so back to our kiddos, back to our students. We have a plethora of data sources, right, that kind of help us in discussion and dialogue and pinpointing what our kiddos need. So we understand numbers and figures and, data points, anecdotal data. We have that information about our students. And it's written down and we put it in a CUME folder and, we go back to it when we have data dives. I'm wondering, how often do we talk about the student's sense of belonging, their social emotional well-being, what's happening or not happening at home, trauma, food insecurity, homelessness, health issues, because all of those factors impact learning at any given point. So we want to consider learner variability and how that's going to help us set a comprehensive approach to how we address the needs of all of our kiddos, particularly our English learners with disabilities. So Katie Novak, not only is she a brilliant woman, I would argue to say that she's kind of a trailblazer in terms of UDL, but she's also a friend. She's a friend to our project, and she's a colleague and friend to us as well. So this quote comes from one of her books that she co-wrote. Variability is the term used to describe just how unique and varied our brains are. So this is not an opinion, this is science, right? No two learners activate the same pathways in the brain. Earlier today, Vanessa was sharing with us an example using her kiddo, her son, Sweet Bubble, and how he was very clear about, no, Mom, this doesn't work for me. Yeah, it's a great strategy, probably even research-based, knowing you, but it didn't work for him, right? It didn't work for him. And the fact that he could advocate for himself and clearly articulate, this doesn't work, but guess what? This does, right? That's what we want our kiddos to be able to do. That, to me, is an element of an expert learner, that not only are they able to advocate for themselves, but clearly understand what works for them, what helps them, and what doesn't. So when we provide opportunities for students to have that sense of belonging, that they are learners, and that so are we alongside of them, we're going to help them navigate through this educational pathway, knowing what that they can advocate for themselves and knowing that they can learn at their pace, to some degree their way, because they know what works best for them. We are going to be able to provide the appropriate resources, evidence-based resources and supports, so that we are successful in guiding them along the trajectory of their educational pathway. So another fan, we are fans of another guru, which is Shelley Moore. If you haven't figured it out yet, we are huge fans of Shelley Moore. So I have a short video that I want to share with you, because she really explains, she has this amazing way of explaining, making concrete these very broad, almost even vague concepts. And this one is all about learner variability. I'm going to share it with you, and as you are listening and watching the video, I want you to think about what resonates with you, what might be familiar to you, some practices that you are implementing, or some mindsets that you may be seeing or not seeing at your respective sites, so that we can have a context for the resource that I will be sharing with you afterwards. So this is Shelley Moore and The End of Average.
5 more minutes. Helpful videos in 5 minutes or less that support the teaching and learning of all students. I'm your host, Shelley Moore, and this episode is The End of Average. Today, I have to give a really big shout out to Todd Rose, because our episode is based around a story that he tells in his book, The End of Average. Go buy this book, go read this book. This book totally helped me understand not only my own tumultuous experience in school, but also my understanding of how to approach curriculum as a teacher. Because what I realized after reading this book is that the idea of should is a direct connection to the concept of average and our ongoing fight against the green. Todd Rose talks about average in the book and actually mentions it as being a very useful concept when comparing large groups of one dimension. Like, for example, if you're comparing the height of a Canadian and comparing that to the average height of an American. That's a great use of average. Big sample size, comparing one dimension. Education, however, isn't that simple. First of all, we're not comparing groups to each other. We're comparing individuals to a group. Second, those individuals that we're comparing are not one-dimensional. People are not just height. Not even paper is one-dimensional. To prove this point further, Todd Rose tells a story about airplanes. In the 1950s, fighter jet pilots, they weren't performing well, and some were even getting injured in their cockpits because they were getting jostled around a little bit. They weren't able to reach for the controls effectively to help them make those split-second decisions needed to operate a plane that's flying like at 1 billion miles an hour. Something just had to be done. So a very smart Air Force researcher went and found 4,000 pilots and took their measurements, the length of their arms and their legs, the width of their hips and their shoulders, 10 dimensions in total, to try and use that data to design a better cockpit for the pilots. Now, in the age of standardization, we could simply just average these measurements and design a perfectly standardized plane. Most people are average, right? Well, you tell me, how many of those 4,000 pilots do you think would fit into an average plane? Just give me a ballpark. 0, none, nada. Not one of those pilots could fit, because not one of those 4,000 pilots had the exact combination of all the measurements in every dimension. The average plane was being designed for a mythical green pilot. Now, another solution might be to use those measurements and design custom-made, individualized planes for every pilot. That would totally work. It just might not be the most cost-effective option, though. Okay, so what do? One individualized plane for every pilot won't work, and one standardized plane for all pilots also isn't working. Is there another option? Well, that very smart researcher realized the solution. It wasn't the average measurements of the dimensions that was needed to design the plane, it was the range of dimensions. Because using a range, the planes could become adjustable. How many pilots can fit into a plane that's adjustable? Every single one. It's the reason why we have adjustable seats in our cars, because you can't just chop off someone's legs if they're too tall. It's so messy. Okay, now let's think about this in terms of curriculum. For years and years and years, we have been struggling with exactly the same problem. We've been trying to fit students into a standardized curricular plane. The error, though, is in the assumption in both of these scenarios is that the plane or the curriculum is static and that it's the pilots and the students that are malleable. The reality is that no one actually fits. We have designed curriculum for Mythical Green students based on averages of multi-dimensional people. Now, just like a plane, it's not cost-effective or efficient to design individualized, custom-made curriculum for every individual student, but we're also realizing that it's also impossible to have one standardized curriculum for every individual student. It is quite the dilemma. But what if we approached it in the same way? What if we stopped looking at the average and instead started to look at the range of our learners? What are their dimensions? But not in terms of what's missing, but instead, what do they bring? What are their stories? What are their histories? Or as my good friend Leighton calls it, their funds of knowledge. How do we find out and use what our students bring in all of their dimensions and design a curriculum that's adjustable just for them? This type of curriculum would allow all students to be successful, every single one. But here's the kicker. In this part really got me. I was thinking about this one day and I was imagining a pilot like crawling into an adjustable plane. And I asked myself, who's making these adjustments? And then it hit me, the pilot. The pilot is making the adjustments. And then when I started thinking about my own students and I realized, wait a second, who's making the adjustments for them? It wasn't them, it was me. I was making the adjustments, the teacher. You know, we talk all the time about growth mindset and student agency, self-regulation of learning, and I realized that this is it. This is what we're talking about. How do we teach students to make the adjustments that they need so that they can fly the plane? We have been so focused on trying to get kids to fit into the plane that we've totally forgotten that fitting into the plane isn't even the goal. The goal is to fly it, to fly the plane. It's our job to teach them how to make the adjustments that they need. Once they figure that out, they can take that plane wherever they want. So this, my friends, is our job. How do we design an adjustable plane? How do we make curriculum responsive to our specific group of learners? There could be a billion answers to those questions. I'll leave you with this. What are you already doing? How are you already getting to know your learners, making adjustable curriculum, finding success for every single learner? This is the question I'll leave you with today. But then I'll say, are you ready to see the end of average?
Daunting task, right? I reflecting on some of the comments and thoughts in the Zoom and then just amongst ourselves today, and thinking about our standards, our curriculum, comprehensive ELD. There was a couple of comments in the Zoom regarding comprehensive ELD, designated, integrated. How do we fit it all in? And that's not even speaking to English learners with disabilities, right? Where does this happen? How do we make it accessible? So what this video did for me, again, towards the end, and Shelley called it out, it reminds me that we're taking the lead in students' learning, and to some degree, I'll speak for myself, didn't consider what they were sharing with me about how they learn best. Back to Bobo, Mom, that doesn't work for me. Yeah, it's a great best practice, and yes, you're the bomb.com. Just aged myself by saying that, didn't I? But this is what works for me. And I think about the times that my students, my fourth graders, my English learners, teacher, can I do it like this? No, we all have to do it like this. And then I think, well, why were they asking me if they could do it this other way? Because that's what was going to help them access and complete the task, right? So again, it really is a mind shift. And like Vanessa said, it's not let's take it all in, let's dump everything out and start from scratch. No, because we know that that's not feasible. But again, back to your sphere of influence, regardless of the hat that you wear, teacher, administrator, coach, gen ed, sped, support staff, what is your sphere of influence? And how can I modify my mindset, right? And start really building a community of expert learners. Because learner variability consists of all these dimensions. That's a lot. That's a lot to consider, Lupita. How am I going to create lessons for each individual learner and, take into consideration what works for them, what doesn't work for them? But we do one thing at a time, right? Know your demographic. Know who your kiddos are. Know who your staff is, right? Because this applies for everyone. We're all learners. And focus in on what's going to be the most high leverage element of that student's learning capacity. So our project focuses on English learners with disabilities, right? So if we don't talk about language, then we're missing our own mark. So for the sake of this training, I want to focus in on language as a learner variability for our English learners with disabilities. Not that the other ones don't matter, they're actually intertwined. But I want to focus in on language because variability can be planned for. It's not going to happen on its own. If we know that we are working with a student who has a very unique way of learning and is also learning English, then we must plan for these two facets, for these two dimensions of this learner. What is their disability and how does it manifest so that I know what I'm looking for and I know how to address it? And then how can I build in some linguistic supports because this kiddo is also an English learner. It's not either or, it's both, right? And it can be planned for. If we don't plan for it, then the result that we will get, or rather the student's lack of progress, is a result of us not planning for that variability. So this is the UDL framework, right? By design, the UDL framework is going to make content accessible, and it's going to create, nurture, an inclusive learning environment. Another resource that exists and has existed for a long time are the ELA, ELD frameworks, the how-to, right? Not the what are the standards. The framework or the how-to. How do I address my different types of learners? This particular graphic is referred to as the circles of implementation. I want to draw your attention to the white part of the graphic where you'll see motivating, engaging, respectful, intellectually challenging, and integrated. So this is the context for learning, right? This is where learner variability basically can thrive, right? When we're taking into consideration the context for learning and we're thinking of, okay, I have a very large percentage of English learners in my classroom. If I create some language supports that are related to this social studies lesson that deals with, the past, I'm going to focus on some past tense verbs because I have a lot of ELs and that's a particular verb tense that they struggle with. All of my kiddos are going to benefit from it, right? I'm going to create some academic language frames for my ELs, but all of my kiddos are going to benefit, right? So when we're taking into consideration learner variability and focus in on a few things and then take into consideration your entire classroom, chances are that the students will have better success and more opportunities to access the content. Another resource is this document here, the California Values for Educating English Learners with Disabilities. This is a resource that we like to share and give you guys some time to explore. So before I give you a couple of minutes to just become familiar with it, I want to share a couple of things. This is a research-based document, and it is based on bodies of research that indicate these items as best practices to help create an environment, a successful environment for English learners with disabilities. It's very specific, right, for English learners with disabilities. So I want you to focus in on the word values. And I like to share this analogy with you before we dive into the resource. If I say that I value a healthy lifestyle, if I truly value a healthy lifestyle, there's going to be evidence of it. You're going to see it, right? Not necessarily on my physical body, because I may be at the beginning of that healthy lifestyle, but I'll tell you what you won't see. You probably won't see, soda, Coke or Pepsi or whatever in my pantry. You probably won't see Doritos. You probably won't see Oreos. These are some of my favorites, by the way, right? Because I value a healthy lifestyle, there will be evidence of it. So with that in mind, I want you to spend just a couple of minutes. Let's put 3 minutes on the clock in just a sec. Think about, where is there evidence of any one, some, a few of these values at your respective sites, offices, classroom? So take that. That's going to be your purpose for viewing. Where is there evidence for any one of these elements in this resource? And let's put 3 minutes on the clock. And again, you're just going to jot down and reflect for yourself. Let's put 3 minutes on the clock. And you just click on the title or click on the screenshot, and you'll be able to access that resource. I know that was not enough time for you to do a deep dive into this resource, but hopefully you were given sufficient time to get the gist of these elements identified as values for educating English learners with disabilities. I want to, before I move to the next slide, I want us to focus on that last element, that shared responsibility. Because ultimately, even though there's no sequence here, ultimately, that's at the bottom because that's a foundation. That's how I see it. That it's a shared responsibility, and that when we work collaboratively, general education, special education, support staff, when we work collaboratively to create learning environments, processes, implementation of best practices such as UDL, when we work collaboratively and use our respective superpowers, like we like to say, your EL lens, your SPED lens, your general ed lens, your UDL lens, when we bring our collective expertise to the table to design and create learning environments, then all of our students benefit. Most importantly, in this case, are English learners with disabilities, because we're designing with their unique needs and their different dimensions of learning in mind. You know, it goes back to the cartoon with the stairs and the ramp. We're building the ramp, and we're not retrofitting the building. We're building it with we're building it with the ramp at the beginning. The blueprint includes the ramp, right? So that it's accessible for everyone and anyone. Another resource is the California English Learner Roadmap. I want us to focus in on Principle 1. There's a video there it's a short video that kind of explains the 4 principles that you can watch at your leisure. But what I really want to share with you is Principle 1, which is focused on assets-oriented and needs-responsive schools, right, in the spirit of inclusive practices and accessibility. But focus in on element E of Principle 1. Specifically calls out English learners with disabilities. It describes valid assessment practices, IEPs that are culturally and linguistically inclusive, leveraging the expertise of specific English learner leads, and creating academic goals that are linguistically appropriate. So these 4 sub-elements are designed to help build, again, best practices, processes, and create learning environments specifically designed for our English learners with disabilities. This resource is a reflection tool that is designed around element E, those 4 sub-elements that I just described. So again, it's a really good tool. These tools exist, they're out there, right, to help us navigate dialogue around how to enhance, improve outcomes, practices, processes for our English learners with disabilities. You have access to the reflection tool via the slide deck. If you want to take a look at it again at your leisure, we don't want to give you the time to do it right now because it's kind of lengthy, but at the same time, when you're thinking about, you know what, we really need to take a look at our assessment practices because, you know, it's not working, you know, our kiddos are being over-identified, our English learners are being over-identified. So let's take a look at this reflection tool. Let's focus in on that first element and have a depersonalize, like Vanessa says, depersonalize the conversation using this research-based tool. So again, this tool is there. It's created and designed specifically to have conversations and take action to improve outcomes for English learners with disabilities. Because we all believe that our English learners with disabilities are able to attain and progress academically and linguistically. I don't believe that anyone, whether you're general education or special education, would argue this point. Again, going back to our values, going back to our sense of belonging, we are all learners as well, and I have knowledge gaps that I lean on Vanessa to help me understand and grow, and so I have that sense of responsibility for myself, and I would dare say that Vanessa does the same, where we lean on each other, and so we ask that's the mindset of folks that are participating and engaging in these sessions, and even those that don't, because you're here, we ask that you share these resources with them and kind of navigate those dialogues through these resources as well. At the end of the day, we are in this profession because we want to be able to have a positive impact and help students gain academic, linguistic, social, emotional progress as they navigate through their educational career. We impact that, right? We have an impact on that. And so the more that we learn and understand, the more that we work together and collaborate, the better it is for everyone, not especially the students, but not only the students, ourselves as well, ourselves and our colleagues as well. Okie doke. Okay, before I move on, I think we need a brain break, right? We have a couple of more resources that I want to give you some time to explore. So let's make some space before we do that. Let's do 5 minutes on the clock. Thanks, Vanessa. We'll do 5 minutes on the clock. Please come back in 5 minutes. And if you have any questions or comment up to this point, you can drop them in the chat and we'll revisit those when we come back from break. So let's come back to this slide as we round the corner to today's session. Specialized supports are necessary in order for English learners with disabilities to be able to access content, develop linguistically and academically, and ultimately achieve their IEP goals. Specialized support. Without the specialized support, without appropriate accommodation, without appropriate adjustment of these resources when they're not working the way that we intended them to work, without these specialized supports, the students are going to fail or they're going to lag in their progress. So I'm going to share a couple of resources. Again, to some degree, I know I'm speaking to the choir. But again, the resources that I'm sharing with you are for you to implement and to share with those friends that you wish were here, sitting here next to you. And by the way, invite them to the next session. So let's talk a little bit about accommodations and modifications for English learners with disabilities. This is a screenshot of a resource right out of the California Practitioner's Guide for Educating English Learners with Disabilities that speaks to specifically accommodations. So what are some of the accommodations that English learners with disabilities can benefit from? Of course, implementing the principles of universal design for learning. I know that UDL may be overwhelming for some folks, and for those of us who are not trained or are in the process of being trained, you may feel like, I don't even know where to begin. But again, taking into consideration the funds of knowledge, the learning variables, you know, what is it that I know that this particular student is going to need? If the student is an English learner, you're going to need some linguistic supports. So it's, instead of being overwhelmed by this framework, think about what the student needs and then use the framework and resources to fill in those gaps. Evidence-based instructional strategies. Evidence-based. right? If we're going to implement a strategy, we want to make sure that it is a research-based strategy, something that is high leverage, a strategy that is going to have an impact because it has already been tried and true. So there are, for example, going back to the note-taking, taking notes from a whiteboard isn't a high leverage strategy. Not even if the skill is to take notes. So think about that, especially when you're feeling like a little bit overwhelmed, or if you hear your colleagues feeling a little bit overwhelmed. Let's reflect and think about what are some of the things that we're implementing that are not giving us the bang for our buck, right? And making sure that what we are implementing are research-based, are evidence-based practices. Instructional materials and curriculum that is culturally and linguistically responsive. So I know full well that the curriculum that you're implementing, you may or may not have had a say-so in, what it is. However, the standards is really what drives instruction. The programs or instructional programs are, and I go like the standards-based, right? Quote unquote standards-based. You have the ability, the training, the expertise to make appropriate not modifications, but adjustments to the curriculum so that if it needs to be more linguistically and culturally responsive, then you have that ability to do that. You have that expertise to do that. So give yourself that grace and know that when there are gaps that need to be addressed, that's what you do. You supplement. You're not going to supplant your program. You're going to supplement it. Again, ensuring that you're using evidence-based practices and UDL principles. And then appropriate accommodations are provided to help the students access. So this is where we really need to become familiar. If you're a general education teacher, you need to become familiar with the IEP and what the students' goals are. You can look at the IEP at a glance, or you can talk to your special education colleague, or both, and have a conversation about what is going to be the very best accommodation for that student. And finally, what I highlighted at the end, accommodations are changes that help a student to overcome or work around the disability. We're not watering down the curriculum. We're not, making it easier per se. We're making it accessible. Another resource that I want to share with you, again from the Practitioner's Guide, is Figure 711. These are some examples, right, and types of accommodations specifically for ELs with disabilities. It's a resource, it's a one-pager. It's a really easy resource to share with your general education friends to help depersonalize that conversation about what to implement. And again, in the spirit of not one more thing, but the thing that's going to work. This resource is based on research, and they are evidence-based practices based on UDL principles, everything that we walked over in the previous slide. So again, a one-pager, a really easy resource to share and have a dialogue around when working together with general education and special education peers, colleagues. And this quote, we like to share it every time because there's a misconception that accommodations are watering down the curriculum. So again, they do not reduce the learning or performance expectations. Rather, they allow the student to complete an assignment with the change that is necessary so that they can access the content, so that it's equitable, accessible for instruction and for assessment. So again, it's important for folks to understand what accommodation is, what it isn't, compared to a modification, what it is and what it isn't. And finally, this is what we do want to give you a little bit of time to explore. This is a resource that Vanessa put together. I have to give credit where credit is due. It's a phenomenal resource that kind of pulls everything together through the context of a particular student. So the student here is Mateo. These student scenarios are found in the Practitioner's Guide. And so what Vanessa did here is she took the student scenario and created this resource with different opportunities, different links, different strategies to help address the very unique needs of Mateo, who is an English learner with a disability. So we're going to give you some time to explore this resource itself. So I'm going to give you some time to pop it open. I'm going to ask you to go to page 4. It starts right here. So because we're talking about an English learner with a disability, I want you to spend a little bit of time on the section titled Integrated and Designated ELD. So as you go through this resource, I want you to spend some time looking at the bullets and the links related to the bullets, because these are resources, some strategies, some examples of what it might look like, what integrated and designated ELD might look like, what are some of the considerations. For in this case, Mateo, who is an English learner with a disability, I think he's a 6th grader, 7th grader, I don't remember, middle school age, right? So I'm going to give you 5 minutes to just become familiar with pages 4 through 6. Maybe look through the bullets, click on the topics that are more pertinent to you. And then I'm going to hand it over to Vanessa, who's going to walk you through the second half of this resource after the 5 minutes. So 5 minutes exploring pages 4 through 6. Jot down some notes for yourself. And then we'll come back and wrap up the second half of this resource. So again, these 5 bullets here call out some specific strategies, some research-based strategies in support of English learners with disabilities. So as you click open the links, you're going to see some concrete examples of some best practices that can be utilized in support of English learners with disabilities, making content accessible and inclusive. So I'm going to pull this up to the latter part of the resource, and I'm going to ask Vanessa to walk us through these tables so she can explain to us how to utilize them.
All right, so as we're looking at this resource, initially we began by looking at the student scenario that introduces Mateo and walks us through the IEP development process for him. So what we've capped off this activity with is having a list of resources that address the specific needs in the development of the IEP and educational programming with access and equity needs, and then all the way down to teaching and learning to meet student needs. So what you'll find here are resources, tools, tables, appendices, websites, protocols, and listings that can support a variety of tasks in developing accommodations, making content and environments accessible, specific to the needs of dual language learners. So when we are starting off with this resources page, what we wanted to do is provide teams with an activity that would allow them to match resources to identify and support individual student needs. In the development of the IEP, well, if we want to make sure that we are preparing appropriately for inclusion and identifying accommodations that are consistent with the student's individual needs, we start off with that checklist, the very basic checklist. Do I have this? Do I have that? And then to elicit additional information from the home environment, strategies to support active parent participation and parent engagement. A form that helps us collect information to establish a parent report, and some examples of linguistically appropriate goals and objectives. A 7th grade example, a high school example, and a 3rd grade example. As Lupita covered earlier, the needs of our English learner students, including those with disabilities, are part of Core 1 tier instruction. We also know that we have an obligation to provide linguistically appropriate goals and objectives for our students, and understanding what a linguistically appropriate goal and objective can be a bit of a challenge, especially when we're not that familiar with those ELD standards. And I want to highlight one of the points that Lupita made earlier, which was that oftentimes, as we are looking at merging our lanes, that doesn't necessarily happen in PD. Again, giving Just some context, in my 18 years teaching at the previous district, it was like tracks almost, where if there was a PD opportunity, there was a set of PD opportunities that were special education specific and a set of PD opportunities that were general education specific. And seldom was there an opportunity for us to collaborate and commingle. And when there was, it wasn't necessarily something that everybody said, okay, well, that addressed all of our needs. It was still very much either this or that. So with that in mind, these examples here really provide you a structured means of taking a look at a goal that is linguistically appropriate based on the student's need. That is, taking the linguistic needs of the student, the established goals that are directly linked to what that assessment report said, the present level said, and then that goal is now driving those minutes of service and what that service might look like. And then as we dig deeper, really taking a look at all of these ELD specific resources that are definitely part of the inclusion equation, especially when we're considering the diverse learners, disability, English learner, and also the different dimensions of identity in providing those equitable and linguistically sustaining and culturally sustaining environments for them to access content and truly have an opportunity to participate in inclusive settings. So how this would work, it would be looking at the Mateo student scenario and finding where these resources would link into. Now, it might be that that's not useful to you at this moment. Where you are in your inclusion journey, what you need is just one thing. And instead of Mateo's student scenario, you might want to consider one particular student that you are going to attempt to provide an inclusive interaction for greater minutes with less service minutes if appropriate, whatever the case may be. Whatever the student you're thinking about is, whatever that situation is. And I can guarantee you that there will be at least one resource here that is going to be supportive in you going above and beyond accessibility, going above and beyond the ramp, and really looking at providing that inclusive setting in a general education setting for their peers. So again, feel free to explore, share out, and keep letting us know which links are broken, because it's important for us to make sure that you have as many of these resources available, because this is very important work. And sometimes we just want reassurance and a support to show us like, oh yeah, I was doing it right. Oh yeah, I do this. And that's always so refreshing, not to feel overwhelmed with the fact of, oh gosh, I have to learn all these different things, but more like, okay, yeah, this is comforting, this is reaffirming. So with that in mind, we're going to return to our slide deck and finally wrap it all up, bring it together, connect back with Dan and Samuel and see what comes to be.
Samuel and two of his friends, Jacob and Fletcher, and I took a great road trip to the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York this summer. There's Jacob, there's Samuel, a 13-year-old with his buddies. We had a great trip. The Hall of Fame was awesome, wonderfully wheelchair friendly, loved seeing all the memorabilia. And then it was time to go out for lunch in Cooperstown. And the problem was we couldn't get into any of the stores or restaurants. As you see in the picture, almost every store had a step of 3 inches or 6 inches. Well, for Samuel, that's like a brick wall to get his wheelchair over a step like that. The kids were furious. It had really, honestly, kind of put a damper on our trip, even though overall it was a great trip. So they came home, and what did they do? They wrote a letter. They wrote a letter to the Chamber of Commerce. They wrote a letter to every newspaper in the area. And they said, we are mad because almost all the stores in Cooperstown are not accessible to someone in a wheelchair. We had $100 to spend on souvenirs. And we made a pledge among the three of us that we were not going to go into a store that Samuel couldn't get into. And we really hope that this letter helps change downtown Cooperstown so that other people don't have to go through what we went through. The letter was published. We got a call from the Chamber of Commerce asking for our ideas and input. I said, you got to have people in your own community who can think about this. You don't need somebody in Concord, New Hampshire. But they were motivated. They were motivated. So I continue to think, though, maybe it's not just about Samuel. Maybe it's not just about his peers. Maybe it's not even about you. Maybe it's about your son, your niece, your nephew, your grandchild. What kind of world do you want them to grow up in? When they have, let's say, a grandparent that develops Alzheimer's or has a stroke and suddenly starts moving in a very different way or talking in a different way, do you want them to think that's weird and freaky and that they are scared of that? When they have a cousin that's born with Down syndrome or autism, do you want them to feel scared and distant and uncertain how to approach that cousin? Or do you want them to know that this is a natural part of life? What kind of world do you want them to grow up in? Who do you want them to be? Who do they want to become? Advocate for inclusion. What I've come to understand is you can't teach this. You can't teach this. You have to live it. You have to experience it. You can't do a lecture on it, even though I'm trying my best. You have to experience it, and you have to be there all the time, every day, around you, in community and schools, alongside people of this type of diversity. This is life. This is part of our world. It has to be seen as a normal part of our world. Now, I've also come to understand that it takes generational change. I mean, don't forget that not long ago, people were smoking on airplanes, right? We were not wearing seatbelts, even in the way back, especially in the way back. We were legally segregating blacks and whites in school. FDR had to hide his wheelchair in public photographs because it was seen as a sign of weakness. But generations have come where these things are not seen as a given anymore. This is generational change. So I think back to another story that I heard from Mrs. O'Brien, Samuel's teacher in elementary school. And she told me that one day there was a family that was resettled from a war-torn area of Africa, Burundi. And this family came to central New Hampshire, came to Concord, knowing nothing about the American culture, language, anything. And literally they came, and because they had been building fires on the floor of the refugee camp the week before to cook their dinner, they built a fire on the floor of their apartment to cook their dinner. But this little girl came into her classroom, and she knew nothing. And the kids said, "Let me show you how to use the cafeteria and get your food. Let me show you what to do on a fire drill. Let me show you around the classroom. Let me help you understand what to do on a field trip." They were incredible with her. They were patient, they were compassionate, they were creative, they were loving. And then Ms. O'Brien said to me, that's what they learned from Samuel. And that's what I've learned from Samuel. Thank you. Thanks.
What thoughts surface now in relation to what we've shared today, what we've learned today, the reflections you've engaged in? What stands out now that you've been through this experience with Dan and Samuel? Coming. What was that again, please?
It just makes me think more and more that accessibility is inclusion.
Okay. Ooh, we're going to build on it. Yes.
I noticed that it's still a social thing, that as society, we still need to open up not only our minds, but also our hearts, and make sure that everybody is included, even if we haven't experienced it, like they said, because it's a niece, it's a cousin, an uncle, what have you. It's just because it's human nature. We have to love each other regardless of how different we look from each other.
Beautiful. Anybody else?
What I want to add to that is the following. So locally, we have a chapter of many chapters of Circle of Friends. And we also have Unified Champion Schools. And a couple of years back, we have a community advisory committee, and we have a couple of groups where we highlight efforts towards inclusion, and we give a couple of awards out. We have community partners, we have school-based partners, etc. One of the years, a recipient of the award was a high school coach. Tough high school coach who was very much, imagine the stereotypical high school coach, that's what it was. However, super committed to including students. And that didn't come naturally with zero reservations. There were reservations. There were questions. There were wonderings. There was uncertainty. But it was still done. At the end, when he was being recognized, he wanted to speak. And a couple of people gulped, wondering at what was going to be said. But he stood up and made a beautiful comment, reflection on his experience. And that was, I worry, but at the same time, I love knowing that my students and I got more of that experience than the students we were including. And let me tell you, there wasn't a dry eye in the house, because that is facts. 100% facts. Being connected to every single member of our community, engaging authentically, meaningfully, is the best way to make those connections and those steps forward towards a truly inclusive environment. Regardless of disability, regardless of English learning acquisition status, regardless of any of the dimensions of identity, it's really about that accessibility, those accommodations that take us not just towards inclusion, but full-on belonging. And that, in fact, is a collective commitment. A collective commitment where we are all ensuring academic success, linguistic progress, social emotional well-being of all of our students, of English learners, students with disabilities, English learners with disabilities, all of our students. This is a shared responsibility. This is a team lift, and it's not just about the school-based teams. It's about parents, families, school and district professionals, community members, everybody striving towards educational equity for quality teaching and learning experiences. With that in mind, I want to invite you to continue participating in this series, A Tiered Approach to Accessibility. Today, as we bring day 2 to the end, we want to ensure that we are providing the necessary processing time of all of this very heavy content, very necessary but heavy and nuanced all at once. Session 3 is coming up, and in session 3, we're having some special guests join us, members of the California Statewide System of Support Open Access. And we talked about UDL in our first session. We talked about accommodations. Today we learned about inclusion, those accommodations that work in tandem with inclusion, specifics to English learners with disabilities. And as a couple of questions popped up in the chat and also here in conversation, assistive technology as a means of providing some accommodation, some accessibility. And for some of our students with very specific language needs, augmentative and alternative communication, or AAC for short. Our friends from Open Access are going to take us in a journey through AT and AAC, considerations for selecting and recommending some of those supports, and the stage will be all theirs on March 5th of 2024, so in a couple of weeks. If you already registered, fantastic. If you haven't, please do. Feel free to share out this flyer. We will be following up with an email on OMS with this flyer as well so that you can share out with your peers. And know that it's going to address some of the questions that came up in the chat related to students with more extensive support needs and specific communication needs. With that, we thank you, we appreciate you, and we welcome you. We welcome your feedback, we welcome your participation in future sessions, and on behalf of our team, Lupita Holguin Rubio, Christina Zavala, and Deborah Montoya, our executive consultant out of Oceanside, even though she's not here with us at SELPA, she's not gone, she's still collaborating with us. We thank you for your time and your attention and welcome any opportunity to connect with you in the future. Thank you so much.